"Daddy, look at the picture I drew." I put on my best appraising my son's artwork face and looked down at the picture he had drawn. I recoiled a little when I saw it, not really sure what to make of it. It was a baby head, like a baby doll, but no body was attached to it. The hair was gone, nothing but dots on the scalp, and the eyes were missing and staring openly. A big silver loop like a smile ran through the head, and the bottom was covered with little metal spider legs. I looked at it for a few minutes, wondering what this horrible thing was, but suddenly it came to me, and I felt silly for being so anxious. "Good job, buddy. It's the spider baby from Toy Story, right?" I said, handing it back to him. "No, Daddy, it's the monster that comes to my window at night." I sighed audibly. The monster had become a point of contention in our house as of late. Every night for the past 3 weeks, my son had woken up screaming because there was a monster outside his window. Ever since we had moved into our new house, it had been a regular nightly event, and I had almost started waking up before the screaming started. It never mattered how fast I ran, though. There was never anything there when I arrived. He was always sitting in his bed, pointing out the window and crying about a monster looking in at him. When we got home, he grabbed his tablet and began to watch Mickey Mouse Clubhouse, as he was wont to do after school. I made sure he was comfortable on the couch and not likely to run out the front door as I started washing dishes. Between the three of us, we usually make a fair amount of dishes. I was just finishing up when my wife came home, grimacing at the picture on the fridge as she came in. "That's an interesting piece of artwork," she said, kissing me on the cheek. "Apparently, that's the monster that's been waking him up every night," I said, making her frown as she sat at the table. "Ugh, the monster again. This has to stop. We have to do something." I shrugged, tossing the drying rag into the sink. "I wish I knew what. What if you spent the night in there tonight?" I looked dubiously at her. "What, like on the floor or something?" "No, you could sleep in the other bed in there." I always forget there are 2 beds in my son's room. They were bunk beds, one on the ground level and one on the top. One was supposed to be for guests, playmates, or cousins who wanted to spend the night. The other was for him. In reality, though, it was more of an excuse for my son to pick a bed to sleep in every night. He usually slept on the top bunk, sitting right beneath the window, but sometimes he liked to sleep on the smaller bed at the floor level. "Okay, I guess I'll spend the night in there. Promise you'll reward me in the morning?" I teased. She said she would and giggled when I kissed her on the ear. That reward would never come, though. That night, we went through our nightly routine after dinner. We brushed our teeth, put on our pajamas, and got ready for bed. As I picked up the book and directed him to the loft bed, though, he grabbed my arm and shook his head. I thought he would argue about bedtime. He wasn't a big one for bedtime. Instead, he shook his head and pointed to the bottom bunk. "Can I sleep there?" he asked, pointing at the bunk. I sighed and looked up at the top bunk, wondering how I would get up that tiny little staircase. One look at my son showed me something was seriously going on, though. He looked scared, too scared for a kid his age, and I was kind of scared myself all of a sudden. What was so scary about this bed? This wasn't the first time he'd balked at the idea of sleeping in the loft bed, and I was kind of hesitant to climb into it. I got over that quickly and told him he could sleep on the bottom if he wanted. So we read our Clifford book, I turned out the lights, and swung up into the top bunk as I snuggled down to sleep. For a few hours, I slept fitfully. I was awakened in the dark of the night by a light scratch at the window. It wasn't a loud scraping. It was soft, like something rubbing lightly against the glass as it attempted to get my attention. Maybe a fingernail, maybe a knife tip, but it was consistent in its efforts as it rubbed. After the picture earlier, my mind tried to conjure an image of a baby head with metal spider legs scrabbling at the glass. In my dream, it dug perfect grooves into the window, like a jewel thief's tool in a movie, and it was making progress through the glass. The baby's head had a mouthful of metal teeth to go along with its legs. The teeth gnashed at the glass as the legs cut, and I could do little more than lay there and watch him cut through the transparent barrier. I woke up as he scuttled in, leaping at my face, its twisted metal teeth twinkling. When I woke up, I thought the dream hadn't quite ended. The scraping continued, that soft, whispery sound, and I opened my eyes and glanced at the window. I was covered up, a pillow over my head, and my eyes peeked from beneath the corner of the blanket. I was still half asleep, and as the crust broke away from my eyes, I thought I might still be dreaming. I saw the baby head, metal legs still scrabbling, pressing against the window. I lay still, watching the little creature bounce off the glass. Its scalp was a stubby patch of yanked-out hair. Its one blue eye looked straight ahead, placidly, while the other yawned vacantly. The metal legs were bumping and rubbing, making scratching sounds against the glass. They didn't seem as dexterous as they had in my dream. The monster thing seemed like a Halloween decoration, something blown by the wind as it swung from a post. And as I watched it shake and spasm, I noticed the ring from the picture. That thick metal hoop ran through the head and connected it to a thick chain. I followed the chain, and the outline of a person began to come into view. He was framed perfectly against the privacy bushes in front of the window, his clothes blending seamlessly. He was tall, 6 feet at least, and his body was large and looked strong beneath his sweater. His face was doughy and pockmarked as it pressed against the window glass, his tongue wet and forming bubbles as it slid over the filthy glass. His flesh was pressed against the window as he looked into the shadowy room, his eyes searching for something. Thankfully, my son probably never saw him, and had only ever seen the strange baby head necklace. If he had seen this strange face pressed against the window, he would have likely never slept in his bed again. The man's eyes found mine suddenly, his crazed look sobering a little as he realized I was not my son. We locked eyes, and I'm ashamed to say I did not deliver some piercing look that scared him away. In my dazed and fearful state, I was just as scared as my son was every night before he started screaming. We stared at each other for a count of 5 before he broke and ran off into the night. The police just left, taking a complete statement and checking the bushes for evidence. My son is asleep in my bed, my wife having wrapped him in her protective arms. I'm sitting on the edge of the bed and setting this to words while it's still fresh. Tomorrow I'm going to the hardware store. I'll be coming back with wood to board up the window. I don't care if this weirdo ever comes back or not. Before I let my son spend another night in that room, I will make sure no one ever peeks through that window again. I just don't know what to do, Mr. Barger. I'm afraid to go down there, but I'm afraid that something may have happened to my son. Killian sat making notes, trying to look everywhere but at the woman sitting across from him. Miss Tolworth was a new ghost, to be certain, and hadn't quite managed to form a death mask yet. She looked leathery, her skin burned, her eyes transforming from crystal blue orbs into sunken pits. Sometimes he would look up to find the slightly reddened middle-aged woman with the frizzy brown hair, and sometimes he would glance towards her and find the cooked jerky woman who was more corpse than client. She seemed to be unaware of this, so Killian tried to keep his face as neutral as possible.
Was it just you and your son on the fire?
When she nodded, he could hear the groan of old tendons. Yes, we both passed in the fire, but he didn't accept it quite as well as I did. He spent most of his time in the basement, a place he spent most of his life, I suppose. I hadn't seen him in days when I went down there, and that was when I saw it. Killian looked down quickly, seeing her mask slip again momentarily, making a thoughtful noise as his thick old pen scratched across the page. These were the tools Killian had used most in life, his pen and pad, and Killian estimated that he had gone through 100 or more of them. He sometimes wondered if he would ever come to an end on this ghostly pad, but after all the cases he'd gone on for the agency, there was always a fresh page ready when he needed it. It was likely something similar to his watch and his clothes, things he'd had on his person when he died, which his memories kept looking the same as they had in life. That was comforting to a certain degree, knowing that when you needed them, they would be there. And Killian hoped that such memories would give Miss Tolworth her face back in time.
Why can't you tell me about your son, Mrs. Tolworth?
Anna, please, Mr. Barker. And when she said it, her face returned to the woman that she had once been. The half-burnt corpse and the vacant eyes were gone, and Killian saw the woman from his report seated on the broken remnants of her couch. She sat amongst the burned shell of her home, the fire that had killed them still being investigated by the local police, and Killian could already see her memories of the home trying to reassert themselves. She would likely move on without much trouble, her mind already prepared, but Killian wasn't so sure about her son. Killian heard something crash downstairs as he made notes, the thump sounding huge and angry. Carla had been pretty clear on what was waiting for him down there, though even she hadn't been completely sure what lay in that broken basement. It's likely a nightmare or some sort of shade drawn by the boy's anger. It's possible that he may have become a geist as well. Either way, put down the creature so that Mrs. Tollsworth can move on. The agency had sent an investigator out to take a look, but it hadn't gone well. Facilitators were a little too dear to waste on petty matters like this. But when investigator Harper had come back with stories of some great beast, the agency had to rethink its stance. The burns on Harper had been like nothing anyone had ever seen. Ghosts were hard to burn, as a rule, and Killian remembered biting his lip as he watched Harker being taken to the infirmary, knowing he'd be called to resolve the dilemma next. If there ever seemed to be an opportunity for the agency to be rid of Killian, they seemed to jump at the chance. Killian had worked with Harper a few times, and the normally put-together old ghost looked like a burn victim. One arm was nothing but angry red bone, and one eye was gone completely. His hair was crisp, a burnt cloud that looked like wire on his spotted head, and the grin he offered Killian looked pained, but no less genuine. "Killian, come to check out the freak show, I see." Killian took a seat in the chair beside him, the nurse who had let him in walking away stiffly.
Freak show? Didn't you always look like that?
The two laughed, until, to Killian's surprise, the ghost coughed. The cough was full of phlegm, and possessed the rails of an ancient.
Harp, I know it's a pretty fresh wound, but I need to know what I'm going up against here.
Harper nodded, leaning back against the pillow as he tried to remember his experience with the creature. As Killian watched, his arm phased, the flesh returning as Harper tried to put himself back together. The eye winked and the spotted flesh flickered, but the burns returned a moment later. Whatever this creature had done to him, it was enough to mark a ghost. He was like a mountain lion aflame. His skin crackled with it, his eyes burning, and the smoke that came off him was like to make you choke. "We don't breathe, Killian. Haven't breathed in 10 years, but this made me feel like I might choke to death. I dragged myself out of that chimney pot, and the next thing I knew, the woman was shaking me and asking if I was okay. Be careful, kid. Whatever this thing might be, it's like nothing I've ever seen before." Killian jumped a little as something bumped the floor, shaking the chair Killian was perched in, the boards shaking as a growl ripped from the basement.
And then, how long has it been since you've spoken to your son?
7 days, I think, she said, looking thoughtfully as her face flickered between her death mask and her memories. Time's funny on this side of the veil. Killian nodded. He certainly understood that. A day, a year, 1,000 years, they all seemed the same to a ghost. Killian had been shocked to find that 4 years had passed since his death, when he'd first been back to the living world. Some ghosts he'd met had no concept of time at all, and were happy to reside in a delusion of their own time. Killian felt sorry for them, but he envied them too. How much would Killian give to slip into a daydream of times gone by, and solve cases with Dom again?
I may not be able to save your son, Anne. There may not be much left to save if whatever's lurking down there has got him, but I'll try my best.
Anne leaned in, taking Killian's hand in hers as she pulled him close. Killian tried his best not to cringe away from her, as her melted face came close to his. "Please, Mr. Barker, please save my boy. I'm ready to move on. I'm ready to see what lies beyond the veil, but I won't leave my son behind. He's always needed me, always needed someone to take care of him, and if I leave him here, I can't imagine what would become of him." Killian nodded, patting her burned hand as he rose from the chair.
I'll try my best, ma'am.
He left her sitting in the ruins of her once comfortable living room and stood at the head of the basement before pressing onward. The air stank of smoke and ash, and as Killian felt a cough rumble up his throat, he realized he was having trouble drawing breath, something he hadn't had to worry about for a long time. He pulled up his collar to cover his mouth, the heat making him squint as he came down the stairs. He could hear something burning down there, the flames chewing up whatever lay below, and the deeper he went, the harder it became to stop his coughing. If he didn't get it under control, the creature would hear him coming, and as he drew out his trusty .38, he reflected that he might only get one shot at it before it hurt him. The basement was a furnace. The walls burned constantly, the flames consuming posters and photos and anything held to them. The squashy furniture and lumpy bookshelves burned as well, the books and knickknacks on them charred and hunched. The bed was little more than a burnt skeleton of wires and metal frames, and that was where Killian saw the creature. He appeared to be sleeping, but Killian didn't believe it for a minute. It was huge. It was as large as a bear, and its fur was living flame. It crackled and churned, an effigy come to life, and Killian felt like his eyes might boil out of his head. He'd never felt anything like this after death, and the feeling was as alien as it was unpleasant. Killian could feel his eyes weeping as the gun became hot in his hand. There was no way that this could be happening. The gun wasn't real, but he could feel his palm burning the longer he stood aiming it at the crouching beast. Killian didn't see a single sign of anything besides the burning creature, and as he squeezed the trigger, the blue flames crackled out, coursing out towards the slumbering thing. Its eyes snapped open, leaping high into the air as its form slimmed and spread across the ceiling. It surged across the wood hungrily, dropping down in front of him as it roared loud enough to shake the space. Killian fired again, more panic fire than anything, and it saved his life. The bullet hit the creature in the shoulder, the flames burning outward like an exploding pine knot, and the beast roared again as it shot back to its nest. It hunkered there, panting as its eyes bored into Killian, and Killian felt like a piano wire as he prepared to snap into motion. Then it did the last thing he expected. It spoke. "Get out of my house. Who are you? Why have you come here? Did she send you? Get out! Get out! Get out! Get out!" It screamed. It almost caused Killian to miss its next move. The lunge was almost too fast to register, and as Killian threw himself to the left, he squeezed the trigger twice. The shots missed, and as Killian rolled, he felt his chest begin to burn. It was more than the smoke and the heat. Killian had used a lot of energy, a lot of his core, to fire the weapon so many times. It had taken a lot out of him, and the heat and the smoke were beginning to get to him. He had one, maybe two shots left, and if he didn't drop his target, he could be unable to move. Killian knew what he needed to do, and if he wasn't quick, he'd be roommates with Harper in the infirmary. The creature screamed at him as it flew into his face, the heat almost too much to bear, but Killian kept his cool as he lifted the .38 and pushed it into its open mouth. As the flaming eyes went wide, Killian pulled the trigger, and the flaming creature shuddered as the bullet flew through it, burying itself in the wall beyond. The creature fell in on itself like a fire log that's been burned through the middle. As it imploded, Killian shook the phantom flames from his arm, feeling the burn and trying to lessen the damage. He could see the creature crumbling, reforming as its roars of pain became dry screams. The burnt lungs loosed their last negation as the blackened form crumpled in on itself. The flames cooled, the room becoming less of a bonfire and more the charred husk that it now was. The young man at his feet could only be the son he had been sent to find, the boy's anger and sorrow turning him into a geist as he lost himself to the flames. Killian stooped and scooped him up, but as he touched him, the boy's body burst into starlight. He fell to sand, running between Killian's fingers, and as he watched, he saw him ascend. Killian had never seen it happen like this before. Most of the geists he ended turned to tar or sunk into the earth, but it appeared that maybe this young man had a chance at redemption. Maybe not. Killian could only speculate, but as he left the basement, he caught one last whiff of smoke and turned to find the source. It was an ashtray, the big glass kind that reminded Killian of the one that had sat on his desk back at the office. It had fallen into the wastepaper basket, the smoldering embers catching, and the basket now burned with some small intensity. This had been the source of the fire, the source of his death, and his anger was clear now. The boy was angry, but he also realized that it had been his fault his mother was dead. He was responsible for the end of his own life, and Killian could imagine that the guilt had finally eaten him alive. Killian came up the stairs slowly, feeling his wounds as he sighed deeply. He was really getting too old for this shit. Anne was waiting, crying silently, as she guessed what he had found. "Dead?" she asked, and Killian was unsure how to respond.
As dead as you and I. He has gone on before you, I'm afraid, and I hope that you find him on the other side.
She nodded, wiping her eyes as she looked at Killian nakedly. "I'm ready then," she said, taking Killian's hand as he led her through the front door and into the agency. She followed him all the way to the large door that separated the spirit world from what lay beyond. From there, though, she had to walk on alone. It should have been the least stressful part of his day, but it was something that Steve would never quite get over. The kids had been bugging him to take them to the fair all week, but Steve would have rather taken off his skin with a cheese grater. He'd been working all week, his legs were killing him, and that wasn't the biggest issue at play either. The thought of bumping elbows and shoulders with people in a setting like that made him feel squeeby just thinking about it, though Steve would never admit to it. Steve had been plagued with haphophobia since he was young. It had been worse when he was younger. Steve hadn't even wanted his parents to touch him, but the thought of strangers touching him would send him into a near catatonic state. He spent years telling people not to touch him, avoiding hugs and handshakes, and stepping around people if they got too close. This set him apart from his peers and made him a bit of an outsider. After years of work and a lot of therapy, he'd gotten past some of it, but he still really didn't like to be touched by people he didn't know. Seeing his kids upset was hard, but Steve just couldn't bring himself to plunge into that kind of environment. Not until his wife had guilted him about it. "I think you ought to take the kids to the fair, Steve." He'd been half asleep, but snorted awake as he rolled over to look at her. The two were in bed, Lisa having gotten off a little earlier than usual, and they were looking forward to a much-needed night of sleep. Steve had nodded, ready to slip off into oblivion, when Lisa had spoken up. "Huh?" Steve asked, as articulate as ever. "You should take them to the fair. It means a lot to them. I'd do it myself if I didn't have to work until 11 on Saturday." "I'm just..." Steve grasped for an excuse that would make her let him sleep and drop the conversation. "So tired from work. The boss has been working as hard, and I don't really think I have the energy to putter around the fair." She rolled over, wrapping her arms around him as he leaned back against her. Lisa would never know how much work it had taken to get to this point, and he never intended to let her find out. He had never told her about his mental issues. He was afraid that she would see him as weak or an oddball and might leave him because of it. He doubted it. They had been married for years, but it was always something in the back of his mind. I know it's been a long week for you, but it would make your kids happy. Please, for me." Steve wanted to tell her no, but it was hard to say no when she was pressed up against him. There weren't many people Steve could stand to have this close. The list was very short. Lisa, the kids, and maybe his mother. He wanted to make her happy, wanted to make the kids happy. So, despite his better judgment, he agreed to take them. So, just before sunset on Saturday night, Steve found the three of them standing at the ticket booth just outside the teeming throng of people that made up the town fair. Even now, he could feel the presence of the crowd. It teemed with life, the sweating masses that would push at him, their skin rubbing at him as he and his kids walked by. The odor was nauseating, even from here, and Steve could feel his skin crawl as he paid the ticket taker with shaky hands. As they headed through the rusty chain link surrounding the fairground with his oldest, Robbie, and his youngest, Charles, Steve knew this would be the biggest test of his mental health in some time. From the instant he stepped inside, he could feel the combined weight of the crowd pressing against him. No one actually touched him. They were a little too polite for that. But the oppressive nature of so many people moving around him was still a lot. The combined smell of sugary fair food, stale sweat, cigarette smoke, and the puff of dry earth from the fairground was like a cloud around him. The warmth of so many people so close to him and his kids reminded him of being too warm in his winter clothes. It was stifling, the miasma of emotions at odds with the smiling faces of his kids, and Steve tried to keep it together as his skin threatened to crawl right off his body. At first, Steve believed he could distract himself from all this. The food smelled good, but it was hard to keep it down with the combined smells of humanity wafting around him. Fried this and battered that went into his stomach, but even the culinary oddities couldn't keep his anxiety at bay. People sat too close to him, their heat radiating into his skin, and Steve began to feel claustrophobic as the crowd pressed against him outside the food tent. Due to COVID protocol, the fair had to ask guests to only eat in designated areas, but that didn't seem to be stopping most of them from walking around with small buffets in their arms. As he came out of the tent like a man who's seen a ghost, Steve thought maybe the rides would be a better distraction. The rides looked fun, but the seats were so close that it was hard to quantify as a distraction. Every ride pushed him closer to his fellow riders, and their skin on his was unbearable. No matter how close he pulled his arms in, no matter how small he made himself, he could still feel the warm, sweaty, disgusting feeling of the other riders beside him as their rubbery flesh pushed against his. He spent every ride feeling more and more like he wanted to crawl out of his own skin, and when Charles reached for his hand at the end of every ride, it took everything he had to grasp it. He felt ready to puke, ready to scream, and after a while he just let the kids ride the rides as he sat back and tried to keep control of himself. Rob and Charles had gone off to ride a collection of rides around the bench that he was sitting on, and as they moved, Steve moved as well. He was aware that they could get snatched pretty easily in this environment, but Rob was stocky for his age, and Steve hoped his size would dissuade anyone from messing with him or his little brother. As he sat on the metal bench, almost feeling the heat of every ass that had touched it before, he wanted to pull his knees up to his chest and feel the comfortable bump of his heart against his kneecaps. He hadn't done that since he was a kid, something that had driven his mother crazy, but he longed for that comfortable press now as the unnamed masses flooded around him. Steve would have never believed that there were so many people in this small town, but it appeared they were all on display tonight. The crowd was thick as they wove up the asphalt path, and Steve felt for his inhaler before realizing it was also something he hadn't used since high school. As the hyperventilation threatened to overtake him, a new player joined the game in the form of a loud groan in his guts. Steve wasn't sure if it had been the deep-fried Oreos or the batter-fried Twinkies, but they had put his stomach in an uproar. He could feel his guts bubbling, the rides clearly doing more harm than good in that respect. He made eye contact with Rob, cutting his eyes to the porta-potty and nodding his head towards it. Rob seemed to struggle with the implications for a moment, eyes darting between his dad and the little plastic shit box, before he finally put the pieces together and gave his dad a thumbs up. Steve was off the bench like a shot, his guts feeling like they were full of eels, and he locked the door as it clattered shut behind him. As he let his jeans hit the floor of the filthy bathroom, Steve felt a wave of calm roll through him. That might sound strange, feeling at ease in a disgusting toilet, but as his backside hit the plastic seat and the sound of the fair buzzed softly outside the rough walls, Steve found that the isolation was what he'd been seeking. Here it was just him and his thoughts, and he breathed a sigh of relief for the first time that night. As he did his business, he felt a sense of ease take the place of the anxiety he had felt for the last few hours. It felt like he might be able to return to the fair now. his burbling guts appeased as he purged the combination of fried foods. He heard his leavings splash below him, but didn't get up immediately. Steve wanted just a few more minutes, a few more seconds of quiet, and he would sometimes wonder if that had been his downfall. The universe, it seems, had found him greedy, and his punishment came a half a second before his eyes opened. He stiffened as he felt it, and could feel every hair on his body standing at attention. Something had touched him. It felt like a finger, just the pad of a single digit, but the feel was unmistakable as it caressed his inner thigh. Steve was frozen, his ease and peace gone as fast as the sour mash that had brought him here. This couldn't be real. Nothing was below him. Nothing that could touch him, at any rate. His anxiety was playing tricks on him, but if it was very convincing. He could feel it creeping up his thigh, going higher and higher, as it threatened to invade something too intimate for his mind to accept. Steve felt himself surge forward, falling onto the floor as his pants tripped his scrambling legs. In the murky light of the porta-potty, Steve saw something as it descended back into the muck of the tank. It was clearly a hand, the finger extended, and as he tried to press himself through the plastic portal to the noisy outside world, he saw it rise from the muck. It was a man, thin as a rail, who seemed to grow taller as he rose from the cesspool. His arms were cartoonishly long, their length dripping with noxious sludge. As he smiled, Steve saw teeth that looked too big for a normal mouth. The crap fell off him with thick plops, a sound that would haunt his dreams for years to come, and when he leaned down to loom over him, Steve felt sure that he would simply unhinge his jaw and swallow him up. Then he slid back into the repulsive stew like a reverse jack-in-the-box, and Steve felt the door open to release him into the barely lighted world. When Steve came scrambling out of the stall, his pants still around his ankles, he was screaming for help. There's something in there. There's something in the tank," he yelled, people gathering as he tried to get his pants up again. The police may have taken their time, but the fair workers had already quartered off the toilet. People watched the door, not wanting to let anyone get out, and the crowd that surrounded Steve was very supportive. He was sitting on the same bench he had run from, a blanket around him as he tried to ignore the well-meaning strangers who tried to comfort him. He'd told the crowd what had happened, blushing at the details as he relived them, and the police arrived about the same time the pumper truck did. His son sat beside him, comforting him as he sat shaking, and he was glad for the firmness of their hands this time. An officer took his statement as the men with the hose set to work. They were using a small pumper hose, not wanting to accidentally suck up whoever might be in there, and Steve couldn't help but watch the hose jiggle and jounce as they emptied the tank. The officers had just finished taking his statement, telling Steve they would get the guy, when the truck driver came up and spoke in a low voice to the officer. The officer rolled his eyes and nodded, flipping the notebook closed as he started to go. "Wait," Steve stammered, aren't you going to arrest the guy?" "Tank's empty, sir. There's no one in there." But, Steve started, his anxiety rising again. That's impossible. I saw it. I saw it with my own eyes." "Be that as it may, tank's empty, sir. It's a crime to misuse law enforcement, sir. I'd suggest you let me get back to work." As they left, so too left the crowd, many of them now whispering darkly as Steve and his sons were left sitting on the bench. They had left then, the fair mostly over by this point, but it seemed the mistrust came with them. If you didn't want to take us, you should have just said so instead of doing something like that." They'd been driving home when Rob said it, and when Steve looked in the rearview mirror, his son appeared on the verge of rage tears. "I didn't make it up," Steve said, wanting to take offense of his son's tone, but understanding his embarrassment. "I know what I saw." Charles was silent, his embarrassment harder for his 6-year-old mind to put into words, but Rob seemed to have a pretty good grasp on his anger. "Yeah, right," he said, looking out the window sullenly. The drive home seemed to take forever, but it still wasn't long enough for Steve to find a rebuttal. His sons piled out when they got home, and Steve could only watch as they went inside and slammed the door behind them. He wanted to be angry. He wanted to rail against his oldest for the way he'd talked to him, but as the anxiety and the shame built up inside him, all he could do was lean his head against the steering wheel and sob silently into the unyielding rubber. He felt violated, doubly so after the judging whispers of the crowd, and he knew the shame wouldn't wash off in the shower. The isolation he felt now brought none of the comfort it had earlier, and as Steve tried to make sense of what he felt, he knew it wouldn't make any difference. He just sat in the driveway, crying into his steering wheel, his impotence almost worse than the fear of being touched. The stranger who had touched him tonight would remain a stranger, and that fact was the worst part of all to Steve. I pushed the sign into the ground and looked at the kids gathering up the street with thinly veiled satisfaction. "Keep off the dirt," it read. I'd seen the way their eyes gleam when the truck came to deliver it, deciding on a preemptive strike. A tall pile of fill dirt was irresistible for small children, and I needed as much of the dirt for my project as possible. Having it scattered all over the yard would make that very difficult, and I needed to post signs before the neighborhood rowdies got any ideas. I went back inside then, not wanting to field questions about my dirt. Sitting in my easy chair, pretending to watch TV, I could see them gathering around to look at the sign. They hunkered over their handlebars and looked dubiously at the sign I had stuck in the mountain of dirt in the front yard. The sign was pretty straightforward, but I wouldn't put it past these kids to find a loophole. They knew me as the cool neighbor, the single guy who gave out full-size candy bars on Halloween and sometimes played baseball in the street with them. The guy who drank on his front porch and sometimes let them fish in his canal, if it was okay with their parents, that was. On some things, however, they knew that I was unbending, and it wouldn't do to argue with me. They all looked up when I came out on the front porch and leaned against the rail to look at them. "If you're hoping to find a play-in-the-dirt free card somewhere on top of that pile, it ain't happening." Reggie looked up, and his face was still hopeful. "Gee, Mr. McQuinty, that sure is a great-looking pile of dirt you have there." I nodded, keeping my face neutral as I tried not to smile. "Sure is, and it's for filling in gopher holes, so I'll likely need all of it. If there's any left, though, I'll be sure to let you kids know so you can trample it flat for me." They rode off down the road, sitting a little higher on their bikes as they realized they might still get to play in it. I shook my head as I watched them leave. I'd never known anyone to get so excited about a pile of dirt, except maybe for a bunch of kids. Something about all that fresh, powdery dirt just made them go a little bit crazy. As I looked at the 6-foot mound of fine white dirt, I almost felt like jumping on it myself. I went inside to finish my preparations, getting my work clothes on and finding my gloves. I sat in the living room pulling my boots on when I saw something out of the corner of my eye. I glanced up, the afternoon shadows just starting to lengthen, and saw a pair of small figures standing beside the road. I paused in mid-tie, looking up to see two small forms looking at the pile of dirt. It looked to be a couple of neighborhood kids, maybe having one last look before getting back to their game. I shook my head. Kids were so predictable. I finished tying my boots and stepped out onto the front porch. "Hey, looking's fine, but I don't want to see anyone in my..." The road was empty. I looked up and down the road. The kids were already playing a game of touch football further down the cul-de-sac. And I picked up my shovel as I thought about how strange that had been. Those two must have really been booking it to make it back to their playmates so quickly. As I started scooping dirt, I thought longingly about having that kind of energy. It would certainly make this job a lot easier. I spent the rest of the afternoon filling in gopher holes. It had been a particularly bad season for them, and the dirt was a band-aid solution at best. The gophers would continue to dig up my yard until I invested in a dog or something. I kept slinging dirt until the sun grew low in the sky, one angry Chuck actually coming up to growl at me before I threw a shovelful of dirt in his face. When it became too dark to see, I thrust my shovel into the pile of dirt and shook the remaining dirt off myself. The kids were finishing up their football game, heading home as the streetlights came on. They all looked longingly at the pile of dirt, but they knew better than to make a play for it while I was standing on the front porch. My cigarette winked on and off as I stood watching the sun go down, and I pitched the end into the dirt as I went inside. I was frying up some hamburgers when I heard the first tremors of laughter from my front yard. Over the sound of popping grease, I could hear the scuttling laughter of children as they played out front. I walked over to the living room window and looked out into the front yard. By the streetlight's ghostly light, I could see them playing on the mound of dirt I had out front. There were two of them, both dressed in dirty jeans and colorful shirts, both having a ball as they capered on my pile of dirt. I was out the door in a matter of seconds, yelling before the door had fully opened. "Hey, just what the hell do you think you're doing? Can't you read? Stay off the..." The streetlights were dim, but even I could see the absence of anybody in my yard. I walked over to the pile, looking around to see if someone was hiding behind it. I saw pretty quickly that wasn't going to be the case. The pile of dirt was hardly 3 feet tall, and a kid would have to get pretty low to hide behind it. I glanced up and down the street, but the only thing moving on the road was an old chip bag pushed by the wind. I looked back at the pile and was shocked to find that I didn't even see any footprints. The wide, low dirt pile still looked fairly pristine, other than my shovel marks, of course. I scratched my head and went back inside. Maybe I'd just been working too hard today. I pulled my fries out of the oven just as they started to burn. I made 2 hamburgers and added them to the pile of french fries. I tipped a beer into a chilled glass and brought both to the table. After shoveling dirt all afternoon, I was tired and ready for a bite. As I lifted the first one from the plate, I heard my stomach grumble as the grease oozed off the meat. I had just taken the first bite when I heard the metal clang of my shovel falling over. I looked up to find those kids playing on my dirt again. I came barreling out the door, my dinner cooling on my plate, as I stormed out to send these kids off. I was becoming frustrated. I'd made it pretty clear that I didn't want people on my pile of dirt. I had been pretty nice about it, posting signs and asking the kids not to mess with it, but it appeared that some of these kids weren't getting it. If I needed to be a bastard to keep these kids off my dirt, I suppose I'd have to be a bastard. I'd barely gotten 2 words out of my mouth, though, before I once again noticed the yard was empty. I was really getting tired of this. I know what I saw, and what I saw was a pair of filthy kids on my pile of dirt. No matter how many times I checked the yard, though, there was never any sign of a trespasser. The strangest part was a distinct lack of footprints, though. The sand was fresh, maybe even a little damp when you got past the top layer. The kids had been jumping on the sand like a trampoline. There should have been footprints, handprints, something. They came back 3 more times that night, but the last is the only one that really stands out. That was the worst of their appearances. They appeared again as I was finishing my dishes, and again as I sat watching TV. I came striding out to holler at them both times, but all I found was an empty yard. This was ridiculous. What the hell was going on here? I know what I saw, but they were always gone the instant I came outside. Nobody could move that fast, especially not a couple of dirty little kids. And what the hell were they doing out after dark? Most of the parents on this block didn't let their kids out after the streetlights came on. Something funny was going on here. The last time I saw them, that night at least, was just before bedtime. I'd thought the pranks were over as time slipped on. It was 11 o'clock, and I was walking through the living room to get something to help me sleep. I was still a little on edge, and I thought that a nightcap might help me calm down a bit. I was coming out of the kitchen with a tumbler of whiskey, the curtains still open on the front yard, when I saw them there. My glass slipped out of my hand as the 2 kids stood crouching on top of my dirt pile. I was speechless for a moment as the angry fire built inside me. I was furious. Who the hell did these kids think they were? They were coming up in the middle of the night, trying to mess with me. But why? I'd made a very simple request. Why were these kids tormenting me? Because I wouldn't let them play on my damn dirt pile? If I had stopped to quell my anger, I might have noticed that something wasn't right with these 2. The night air was cool on my bare chest as I came shambling out of my house like an angry bull. Who the hell do you think you are? It's almost midnight. Get your asses over here right now. I'm going to call your parents and let them know what you've been up to. I got a good mind to... They hadn't moved this time, though. They just stood on that mound of dirt like 2 scrawny scarecrows, glowering at me through the dirt caked over their face. My God, had they been eating the dirt or something? I had thought them filthy, but these kids were downright grimy. They didn't seem at all concerned with me, but I definitely had their full attention. I'd come half into the yard when I saw their eyes. They both seemed to have a nasty case of red eye. They stared at me, their eyes seeming to glow somehow. and I suddenly noticed that they cast no shadow in the dim streetlight. They should have. The dirt pile and my shovel cast a long gantry into the falling streetlight, but these two had nothing. I had stopped barely 20 feet from the pair when the larger of the two took a step towards me. When his dirty sneakers gritted against the loose earth, the red piping looked faded beneath all that mud, and I saw the earth drop over it like a hand. He opened his mouth, trying to say something, but all that came out was wet soil. Sand and mud bubbled out from over his lips, and the dirt that had covered his foot had begun to slide up his leg as well. He fell to his knees, clutching his throat as he coughed up leaves and mud as well. The sand slid over his hands and up his arms. Even as the dirt bound the first boy to the pile by his knees, they both struggled, trying to free themselves from the prison of sand, but their efforts were ultimately in vain. The sand reclaimed them both in a sudden whoosh. In a blink, they were both gone again. I walked backwards, never taking my eyes off that pile, until the door was closed between us. The next day, I set to work early. I wanted that pile of dirt out of my yard before nightfall. I worked diligently, filling in holes and putting dirt to good use. I used it to fill in a few of the potholes in front of my house even. I just wanted as much of it gone as I could manage. I no longer cared how it happened. When the kids came by on their bikes, I told them to leave. They seemed disappointed, but I didn't want them anywhere near that dirt pile. I was filling in an exceptionally large gopher hole when something caught my eye. I had nearly turned back to the pile when something pale and long made me take a second look. At first I thought it was a worm, but the more I looked, the more I thought I knew what it was. I bent down, the shovel hitting the ground woodenly, as I reached down to pick up what I hoped was a bleached piece of wood. It wasn't, though. It was cold, malleable if not unmovable, and crooked like a sea of pale purpling flesh. The perfectly filthy nail was hardly visible at the tip of the small finger. I went back to the pile and saw the rest of the hand poking out from the bottom, minus the finger I had accidentally amputated. The cops came when I called, and they brought dogs with them as well as the big white forensics van. They excavated the bodies of a 10-year-old boy from the bottom of the dirt pile, his face frozen in a look of terrified disbelief. He was dressed in very dirty, if not very familiar clothes, and his sneakers had that same filthy red piping that I'd seen the night before. When they lifted him free, they found that his hand was intertwined with something else that also came loose. The other boy had been about 8, and the two had died hand in hand, it seemed. The police had wanted to arrest me, or at least bring me in for questioning, but the forensics guys had figured out pretty quick that these kids had been dead for the last month. A quick search determined that they had been on the missing persons roster for about 3 weeks, and their parents had feared they'd been abducted by some pervert. They'd been playing near the sand pits before they'd gone missing, and the coroner would later find dirt and mud in their lungs and mouth. He figured they had been climbing the big sand piles out there, piles just waiting to be scooped into a truck and sold as fill dirt, when one of them had been sucked down by a pocket of air or an empty spot in the pile. His brother had tried to help him and ended up getting pulled down as well. The two had suffocated as they tried to get out and been picked up by the fill dirt as they trucked it to the company I had bought it from. It happens sometimes, the coroner had told me when I'd asked about it a few weeks later. Kids never think about that kind of thing. They just see a big pile of dirt and start climbing. I haven't seen the two since they took the bodies away, and the company I bought it from came and got the rest of it before they gave me a full refund. I hope they find peace wherever they are now. I think, from now on, I'll just hire someone to fill the holes in my yard. I don't ever want to see another pile of dirt for as long as I live. I growled as the bawling cut across my dreams. This was my 3rd night in the box, and I was getting tired of being woken up by the loud crying from somewhere in the quad. The inmate spent his days in an almost abject silence, no one stopping at his cell with mail or call-outs or any of the usual stuff. I never saw them come out for showers. I don't even think I'd seen them get a tray during meals. All they really did was cry at night and keep the whole block awake. I huffed out a long, suffering breath and rolled on my bunk. My cellmate, an old guy named Tobbs, looked over the edge at me and shrugged. He reached up for his ears and pulled out a pair of earplugs he had made out of toilet paper and held them out to me. I just shook my head, knowing they wouldn't block out the crying. After getting zero sleep on my first night, I tried talking to the man and finally just gave up. It seemed that the crying couldn't be blocked out by normal means, and my brain simply couldn't be tired enough to block it out completely. "It helps a little," Tobbs lied, but he smiled as he said it, the light from outside making his grin look ghastly. "What's his problem anyway? What's he got to be so upset about?" I asked grumpily. That wiped the smile off of Tobbs' face, and I saw him roll away and face the wall. "It's best not to think about it. He's just getting by in his own way." That seemed to be Tobbs' way of saying, leave it alone. I had been a guest of Stragview Prison for about 3 years now, but this was my first trip to the box. They had caught me in a shakedown a few weeks ago, and some jackass had decided to hide their drugs under my bunk. The guards hadn't wanted to hear about how it wasn't mine. Possession was 9/10 of the law, after all, and I was processed and whisked off to confinement. 3 days later, I was exhausted and ready to snap. I rolled over and tried to block out the crying and get back to sleep. The next day, I tried to ask Officer Malkin about the inmate, but he just told me to shut the hell up and take my tray. Malkin was a grumpy night shift guard that seemed to think that shut the hell up was synonymous with good morning. I probably wouldn't get anything out of him, so I figured I'd wait for the day shift to arrive. Officer Timaeus was a pretty bubbly guy, and he could usually be counted on for some conversation. When day shift arrived, though, Timaeus looked at me like he didn't know what I was talking about. "I don't know what the hell you're talking about, inmate. You must be mistaken." And he wandered on with the call-out sheet. "Best to just drop it, kid. It's just one of those things it's best not to ask about." I nodded at him, but his answer made me more curious than anything. What was the guy's deal? Was he just crazy or what? And why didn't anyone tell him to shut the hell up? I knew I wasn't the only one he was keeping awake, and the idea of a bunch of cons just letting this guy lose them their hard-earned sleep made my head hurt. My situation only got worse around lunchtime, when Sergeant Mefford arrived with Timaeus and Sergeant Bassford from the captain's office. They cuffed us, told me to move to the back of the cell, and told Tobbs to approach the door. They opened the door and pulled him out, keeping a wary eye on me like I might charge them in handcuffs. Once he was out, they closed the door and took the cuffs off, telling him his time was served and he was being released from confinement. He looked back once to give me a grin and a thumbs up as Bassford led him towards the quad door, towards the outside world. And just like that, I was stuck in that 12x8 cell by myself. Most people would have jumped at the chance to have a cell to themselves, but I wasn't as excited about it. Being alone in a small box with only myself for company gets old pretty quick. With a roommate, you have someone to talk to or play cards with, but alone, it's just you. I sat on my bunk as the quad buzzed with general noise, and it didn't take long for me to get bored. I spent the rest of the day trying to trade for a book, but only managed a ratty magazine that I devoured like a starving man. That night, the crying started again. It was just after lights out, and I was exhausted after sleeping so poorly the night before. I had just laid down, getting comfy as I prepared to pass out, when the deep, sorrowful crying began again. It echoed through the quad, bouncing off the walls, and seemed to circle like a hummingbird. I heard mutters and sighs, people trying to make the best of their situation and get some sleep, but the wailing just went on and on. It always stopped when one of the guards came in to do a round, and I would just get close to falling asleep when they would walk out, and the wailing and crying would start again. The crying stopped as the sun came up, but it was too late for me to sleep by then. I was exhausted from the days on end of having little sleep. I drowsed most of the day, roused for meals or mail call or call-outs, and the other common occurrences that happen in prison. I found myself napping fitfully, fully clothed so I'd be ready if someone important came in, and wanting nothing so much as to sleep for hours on end. Being in confinement, I could sleep if I wanted to, but with no escape from the noise or the bustle, I was left in a state of tiredness, knowing there would be no reprieval tonight. I blame the lack of sleep for what happened next, but I know it wasn't completely due to that. I was simply the first one to snap. That third night, it all became too much. The crying echoed across the quad, leaving many of us grumbling, but no one willing to say anything to him. This was very odd, since I'd heard guys yell at each other over whistling after 8 o'clock, and this guy was getting away with keeping the whole quad awake. When the officers came in at 10, I tried to get their attention, begging them to shut the guy up. My neighbor tried to shush me, but the guard just rolled his eyes and told me to sit down. I kept calling, but he ignored me, and soon the door was closing behind him. We all sat in the pregnant silence for a few minutes, and I thought he might have heard me ask the guard to talk to him, realizing he was a nuisance. I lay down on my bunk, the crunchy plastic mat sitting firmly against the hard metal rack, and closed my eyes as I tried to sleep. Maybe he would be quiet now. Maybe he was just sane enough to realize that he was driving us all nuts. Maybe he realized that, scared or not, someone would remember that he had kept them awake when they got back to the yard, and that someone would probably put a knife in him. I was almost asleep when the wailing echoed out again, louder than ever. That was when I snapped. "Shut up! Shut the hell up! People are trying to sleep!" I came off my bunk, face pressed against the glass on the door, as I yelled into the quad at the stupid idiot who was crying. I didn't care if the guards heard me or not. I just wanted the idiot to quiet down so I could sleep. Other people in the quad tried to shush me, telling me to be quiet before he heard me, but I didn't care. I wanted him to know what an asshole he was being, and I wanted him to stop that stupid wailing. When my yelling stopped echoing around the quad, I realized that the wailing had stopped. The silence that followed was oppressive. The absence of the wailing now seemed strange, and the silence of my fellow inmates was equally as odd. I hadn't expected full-fledged applause, but I had expected a few complimentary comments. People usually celebrated someone willing to tell off a noisy inmate, and their lack of any kind of talk made me nervous. I went and sat down, leaving the quad in a state of absolute silence, as my eyes slid shut and I started trying to get some sleep. Who knew how long this wacko would be quiet for, and I wanted to get a little shut-eye before he started crying again. I had just started to slip off when I heard it. Tap, 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 tap. Someone was tapping the glass on my cell door. I tried to ignore it. Maybe it was one of the guards wondering why I'd been yelling, and if I ignored them, they would just assume I was asleep. I felt my tired mind trying to slip off again when the tapping came a second time. Tap, 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 tap. I sighed and sat up, looking at the glass on the door. They made you sign a big long list of rules before you got a cell, and one of them was not yelling into the quad. Some guard who thought he was cute wanted to remind me of the rules, just to be a dick. I got half off my bunk before I caught a good look at the face on the other side of the glass. It was white, its eyes like hollow pits, and the fingers it raised were crusty with old blood. I moved as far from the door as I could, screaming and thrashing as it stood tapping at my door. The fingers tapped again and again as I tried to ignore it. I slid under my bunk, but they did little to block out the sounds of those dead fingers. I put my pillow over my head, but the hard canvas thing did nothing to block out the constant tapping. Who the hell was it? Was this some kind of crazy inmate who had gotten out? Some guard playing a trick? I wrapped the sheet and the blanket around myself as I tried to block him out, secure in the knowledge that at least I was safe behind that big rolling door. I lay under the scratchy blanket for a few more minutes, dreading the tapping, but listening nonetheless. The darkness beneath my blanket was broken by shafts of light as they cut through the thin material. The light streamed unhampered through the little glass of the door, and its uninterrupted shining made me realize that the face was no longer there. What was more, the tapping had stopped, and I felt a sigh slip out as I realized that whatever it was had moved on. I slid the covers down a little and glanced at the door, feeling relieved at the empty window before rolling onto my side to try to get some sleep. Just as my eyes closed, my head facing the familiar gray wall, did I see him leaning there amongst the shadows. He looked bored, unsure of himself, and now that I could see him clearly, he appeared young. His eyes were black, sunken pits that seemed devoid of any means of sight. He was skinny to the point of emaciation, and his grimy hands constantly gripped at the waistband of his prison uniform pants. His nails made a whispery sound across the fabric, and his dirty long nails were crusted with rusty red residue. As we made eye contact, I could see the residue's source. His throat had been cut deep enough to nearly detach his head, and gaped at me like a leering mouth. I had only a matter of seconds to take all this in before I closed my eyes and pretended to sleep. There was little else I could do. I couldn't escape him. That door wouldn't open, no matter how hard I pulled at it. He didn't seem to want to jump on me and kill me, not yet anyway, and his silent watching made me think I could just ignore him. The idea of sleeping with this thing in the room was not an option, though. My only hope seemed to be to wait for the guards to come by on another round and notice him in there. What would they do if they saw it, though? Would they get rid of it? Could they get rid of it? My eyes pulsed behind my eyelids, hearing the whispery sound its nails made against its pants. The stiller I got, the more I became aware of its raspy breathing as it loomed against the wall. The darkness behind my eyelids seemed like a breath of fresh air compared to the nightmare that now inhabited my cell. I tried to stop myself from shuddering as I lay there, hearing its breathing and wishing for the wailing again. The wailing would have drowned out the scrabbling of its claws and the sucking gasps from its neck wound. Its flat feet made a plopping sound when it took a step towards me. I quivered beneath my blankets, hearing the harsh sound of its breath as it slithered through its neck wound. It took another step, the scratch of its nails having stopped now as it stepped closer. The cell was small, and it didn't have far to come before it was very close to my exposed face. I kept my eyes shut tight, the rattling of its damaged throat right in my face, and I had to work very hard not to start hyperventilating. It was close enough to shred my face with those crusty, bloody nails, and I remember thinking that if I could just get through this without shaking to pieces, I'd be very lucky. I wasn't aware right away when the breathing left, but when the cell lights came on, I realized I'd been trying not to scream for nearly 6 hours. I couldn't sleep that day either. It wouldn't come out during the daytime, but I knew it was there. If I lay on my bunk, I could hear that raspy neck breathing from under the bed as it hid in the dark crevices. It didn't like the light, it seemed, and it would only come out at night so it could hide in the dark corners and watch me. No one would talk to me. I had become a social pariah, and I sat in contemplation for most of the day, trying to figure out how to make this creature leave me alone. It was a long and boring day, and I had plenty of time to think, plenty of time to plan. The longer I thought about it, the more I believed that it had been the wailing that kept it away. The creature must have been afraid of the wailing inmate who lived in that room. Had I hurt his feelings or something? I needed to figure out how to make him start wailing again. If it scared this thing away, it would be worth the sleepless nights. I tried talking to him through the grate in the back window, tried sending him kites under the door, but nothing seemed to get his attention. After yelling myself hoarse and using all the paper I had in my possession, I felt like I only had one chance. Tomorrow was one of 3 shower nights we had every week. The guards always took me to the shower nearest my cell, the cell nearest to his cell. I could talk to him, make him understand how sorry I was. Maybe he would understand why I needed him to keep crying. I just had to make it one more night. That night was the worst night of my life. When the lights went out, that creature came slithering out from under my metal rack. I heard his nails scraping on the concrete floor as he drug himself out and turned my head to the wall as he rose to his full height. I couldn't see him. He couldn't get between the wall and my face, but I could see his shadow across the wall as he loomed over my prone form. His heavy breathing filled the cell as he rasped and husked, and I believed I would go crazy as I lay there watching his shadow. I was exhausted, near to my breaking point, but my fear kept me from snatching more than a few seconds of sleep at a time. My biggest fear was that he would simply fall on me and devour me, or slither into my bed and wrap his long, pale arms around me before breaking me like kindling. I didn't know what he wanted, was no closer to finding out what he wanted than I was at the start, but he spent that night much as he had the one before, bent over me and breathing soupily. When the cell lights came up, I breathed a sigh of relief as his shadow left me. I got up and moved to the top bunk. The bare mattress was cold against my skin, but I didn't care. I lay dozing, listening to his thick breathing and feeling afraid all over again. Guards offered me food, offered me rec, offered me cleaning supplies to clean my cell, but I spent the whole day ignoring them as I lay in a state of fitful insomnia. I was too afraid to sleep, too afraid to stay fully awake, and as the sun went down, I knew it was nearly time to enact my plan. I couldn't weather another night like the last 2. I stripped down to my boxers, grabbed my towel, and was waiting when they came to get me. I kept close to the wall, aware that this was his time, even if the lights were on, and not wanting to get grabbed and miss my chance. I could still hear him under the bed, and I knew that all he was waiting for was a chance. When the flap came down and the guard told me to cuff up, I put my hands out and was restrained before the door rolled open. I walked out, turning towards the shower, before breaking away and running for the cell nearest the shower. The guard stumbled, yelling as he fell on his backside, and I heard the angry feet of his partner closing in. I'd only get one shot at this, and as I hit the door, I began to plead my case. I was so sorry. I shouldn't have spoken to him like that. Please start crying again, so the creature in my cell would... Before the guards hit me, though, I noticed my miscalculation. The cell was empty, free of inmates or mats or anything. There had never been anyone in that cell. Correction, there had been someone in that cell. When the guard tackled me, they dropped me on my jaw and dislocated it. A little overzealous, maybe, but they saved me in the long run. When they realized what had happened, they took me down to the infirmary so the nurses could reset my jaw. They wanted x-rays, wanted a second opinion, and I had been checked into the infirmary for the night. As I lay there, jaw hurting, I write this in my journal so that someone will know what has become of me when I return to my cell. I don't know what it wants, but I know why it's haunting me. I called it out, I acknowledged it, and now it has marked me. It hasn't followed me here. This is not the place it's tied to, I suppose. But if I return to that cell, it will find me, and they will find me dead in that place. The creature is the source of the wailing, but its constant staring is far worse than the nightly caterwauling. If they put me back in that cell, it won't have to kill me. A few more nights of that, and I'll do it myself. Susan smiled as she watched Gus paw at his reflection in the mirror. "Did you find another cat to play with?" she asked, and Gus looked back with a meow before pawing at his reflection again. She was glad that Gus had found someone to play with, even if it was just his reflection. Gus had been depressed lately. They say that having only one cat could lead to this sort of thing. Cats are social animals, after all. Gus couldn't really play with any of the strays outside Susan's apartment, because she was on the 3rd floor, and a little out of reach for even the most nimble of the wandering felines. That didn't stop Gus from standing on her balcony, though, meowing at the cats below and trying to get their attention. Susan thought it was kind of sad, watching him paw at the screen as he called down to the cats who lived their lives in blissful freedom. But the apartment contract had been very clear on their one pet per unit policy, and Susan didn't want to move just so Gus could have a playmate. Gus was a big orange tomcat that Susan had found wandering near her parents' house before she moved out. He'd been a scrawny little kitten when she'd found him, and she had fallen in love with him almost instantly. Susan had just gone through a bad breakup when she had stumbled across the sad little kitten near the garbage cans one morning. The little fuzzball had helped her get through her loneliness, and she liked to think that she had helped him as well. When she moved out of her parents' house at the end of the year, Susan had taken the little cat with her. She and Gus had been roommates ever since. Gus was a great companion, and didn't seem prone to the midnight zoomies or the sometimes destructive behavior her friends complained about in their cats. Gus liked his scratching post, snuggling in bed with Susan until it was time for her to get up, and eating his own food instead of hers. His only real issue seemed to be his loneliness, and Susan could hardly hold that against him. Watching him play with his reflection in the mirror was as cute as it was sad, like a kid playing with his imaginary friend because he couldn't seem to make any real ones. Susan watched him as she got ready for work, and she pulled out her phone as she took some video for Instagram. The scrawny little kitten had grown into a regal orange ball of fur, and to watch him paw at the surface of the mirror was insanely cute. He would cock his head and meow at his reflection sometimes, looking confused at the cat in the mirror, before going back to pawing at the glass. Susan smiled, but there was something just a little off-putting about that confused head turn now and then. She left him staring at himself in the mirror, his game forgotten, as he seemed to be talking to the orange cat in the mirror. Susan came home to find him still sitting in front of the mirror. She asked him if he'd been there all day, and Gus just looked back and meowed before looking back at the mirror again. He was staring at himself, his ears moving back and forth, seeming to Susan like he was having a conversation with his reflection. Growing up with cats, she had seen them sit next to each other and do just that same thing, and Gus's eye contact was more than a little interesting as he watched himself in the mirror. She tried to ignore him as she slid into her PJs, but it was hard the longer it went on. "Come on, Gus, want to watch a movie with me?" she said, patting the bed as she fiddled with the TV. Gus looked up, meowing happily, but then turned back to the mirror and did an oddly unsure little head cock as he took a few steps towards the bed. In the end, Susan had to come get him and take him over to the bed, as the poor old Tom watched the mirror. Susan saw nothing out of the ordinary, the mirror cat just scooped up by her own mirror reflection, but this behavior was wandering into the realm of creepy rather than cute. Gus sat with her happily as Susan watched Friends for the 1000th time, but she caught him glancing back at the mirror more than once as she stroked his silky fur. He wasn't the only one. Susan couldn't help but glancing at it as well, looking at the mirror as if she expected to see something out of the ordinary. She didn't, but it was definitely starting to creep her out. Susan let her keys fall into the bowl by the door, calling for Gus as she slid her shoes off. It had been such a long day. A creepy old man had hit on her at work, the customers were rude, and Susan sometimes wondered why she didn't just quit. She could do better than an assistant manager at a grocery store, and she knew it. If it hadn't been for Gus in this apartment, she'd have likely walked away a while ago. Speaking of Gus, where the heck was he? He almost always came to greet her at the door. She called him again, but there was no response. She went to the bedroom and huffed out in mock outrage when she saw him sitting in front of the mirror again. Okay, Furface, this is getting to be a little much. It was cute at first, but now it's super creepy. He meowed pitifully when she picked him up, pawing gently as he tried to get away, but she took him over to the bed and sat down with him. He watched her dutifully as she got changed, his fluffy head turning back to the mirror from time to time as Susan slid into her pajamas. And she couldn't help but glancing at it as well. She wasn't sure, but felt like she could see something moving there when she wasn't giving it her full attention. The mirror was the large rolling kind that the apartments often came with, the one on the closet doors. You could see the whole room in it, and it slid to the side on tracks if you needed something out of the closet. It was a nice amenity to have when you were getting ready in the morning, but it was starting to creep Susan out the longer she looked at it. She got that spidery feeling as she put her back to it, like something was watching her. When she pulled her hair into a ponytail and turned to put it up, she almost dropped her scrunchie. Gus was staring at her, head cocked, as he watched her from the front of the mirror. She stepped back, startled, and when her legs bumped against the chair in front of the vanity, she sat down hard. Something came off the bed then, and she heard Gus meowing as he looked at her as if to ask if she was okay. Susan looked back at the mirror and saw that it was empty again, save for her own surprised face and the furry reflection of Gus as he stood by her leg. That night was the first time she covered the mirror. She took some thumbtacks and an old throw blanket and used them to cover the surface. It was silly. She knew it was silly. But she felt better when the mirror's surface wasn't looking at her anymore. Gus walked over to inspect her work, and Susan picked him up as he began to paw at the blanket. Gus would just have to get over it, she thought, and she took him to bed and put something on to distract her and her fears. As she scratched his ears, she felt better, and as the night went on, she almost forgot all about her silly fears from earlier. When she woke up, though, she saw that the blanket had been pulled down, and Gus was again talking to himself. This became a daily routine for her. The first thing she did when she got up or got home from work was to cover the mirror and tell Gus to stop pulling the blanket down. Gus would meow when she did this, looking at the blanket and pawing at the covered surface of the mirror, but Susan was unmoving in her decision to keep the blanket up. She would usually pick Gus up as he pawed pathetically at the blanket and take him off to pet him, but it never stopped him from coming back to it. It never stopped him from uncovering it again, and Susan just accepted that this was Gus's new obsession. The cuts on her big fur ball were a little harder to ignore, though. Sometimes, while stroking his silky fur, Susan would encounter a scratch or a bite and wonder how exactly he had gotten it. They weren't the sort of wounds a cat could get from just scratching themselves. At least she didn't think they were. When she noticed a bite on the tip of his ear one afternoon, she actually searched the house to see if another cat might have gotten in somehow. His food bowl never emptied any quicker than usual, and there was never any extra scat in the box. If there was some secret cat living in the house, it was extremely quiet when she was there. The only strange thing was Gus's melancholy seemed to have disappeared. His mood had improved, and he spent less time meowing to the cats below the balcony. The only change was that she had to shoo him away from the mirror constantly. If he wasn't in her lap being petted, Gus was at the mirror or at the blanket that covered it. He never took it down while she was there, but he would put his face underneath it or just stare at it like he could hear someone talking. Susan found this extremely off-putting, but what could she do? The mirror was attached to the closet door, and without it, Gus would be free to leave his long orange fur all over her clothes that she had hanging in there. Also, as much as it creeped her out, she couldn't stand to think of Gus being sad again while she was at work. Then, one day, something changed. She came home to find the blanket down, and Gus looking at himself as he always did. "Seriously, Gus? This is getting annoying. I hate having to put this blanket back up every..." But she stopped when Gus turned his amber eyes to stare at her. The two held their gaze for a few moments, but Susan couldn't help but hear the voice of her subconscious as it screamed that this wasn't her cat. It looked like Gus, it sat like Gus, and was a perfectly adorable little ball of orange fluff, but his eyes were different. They were the same amber gold they had always been, but today they were filled with hate. No, not hate, Susan supposed. It was something else, like a king looking at a mud-covered serf. Not with pity, and certainly not with any desire to help it. Gus looked at her with scorn and something akin to disgust. How exactly a cat could portray these things with its fuzzy little face, Susan didn't know, but that's what it was. Gus loathed her. She suddenly caught him by the scruff, and when he hissed at her, Susan realized it was the first time she'd heard him do that. He swiped a fat ginger paw at her, and Susan almost dropped him as his claws sliced her wrist. Gus growled and cried in his angry little voice, a voice that was suddenly less cute than usual, and Susan tossed him into the hall and closed the door. Gus bumped at it, hissing and yowling, and Susan was surprised when she realized that her back was against the door. It was like she thought he might just come through the door. She locked it just in case and walked into her bathroom as she washed the cut with soap and water. It wasn't very deep, but the 3 long scratches had been right across her wrist. She had just finished putting some Bactine on it and looking for a Band-Aid when she heard Gus's pitiful meow from the other room. That sounded more like the lovable Fluff Susan knew, so she slapped the Band-Aid on and went to open the bedroom door. Perhaps she had just startled him as he had startled her. She hadn't grabbed him by the scruff of the neck since he was a kitten, and he was quite a bit heavier now. Susan suddenly wondered if maybe she had hurt him, and she opened the door as she prepared to pull him into a hug. "Sorry, Gus, you just scared me. I wasn't..." But she opened the door and noticed that he wasn't there. She checked the hallway, but Gus was nowhere to be found. Susan shrugged, tallying it up to strange cat behavior, and finished doctoring her arm before going to start dinner. As she cooked, she kept expecting to see Gus come out and sniff or rub up against her leg. Gus was always so curious, and he always came to have a look when she was cooking or watching TV. He had even jumped into the shower with her a few times, though he always instantly regretted it. She began to feel guilty about what had happened earlier and just wanted to find him so she could pet him and say she was sorry. Even so, those weird eyes kept coming back to her. She couldn't shake the idea that that cat hadn't been her Gus. She didn't see him again until she was cleaning up and getting ready to take the garbage out. Susan was in a bit of a hurry as she tied the bag up and started pulling it out of the can. The plastic pan the chicken had come in had likely leaked into the bottom of the bag, and she wanted to get it to the dumpster before it dripped onto the floor. She hadn't seen Gus since she'd put him out, not even as she ate chicken Alfredo on the couch. He was likely still sulking somewhere, but she figured he'd come out when it was time for bed, and all would be forgiven by tomorrow. She thought she might have heard him, though, and he sounded upset wherever he was. Susan had cocked an ear several times as she cooked, listening to the meows of a familiar cat from the back of the house. She had called him, even taken the tuna he liked to coax him out, but he had never poked his head out or shown any interest in any of it. Susan had looked all over for him a few times, but as the sound of her sauce bubbling began to sound more like burning, she always returned to the stove. She walked to the door with her swinging bag of trash, and when the door came open with a loud creak, she heard claws scrabbling on linoleum. Susan saw an orange lightning bolt come barreling out from behind the china cabinet and make a break for the open door. She moved purely by chance, and Gus hit the trash bag as he yowled and smacked against the cans and packages inside. Susan dropped the bag, no longer mindful of the chicken drippings, and reached for Gus before he could escape. He had never tried to run away before, not even as a half-starved little kitten, and when her hands settled around him, he yowled and slashed at her furiously. He clawed at her hands, swiped at her face, and Susan stepped back when one paw scored her across the cheek and thought about the garbage a little too late. Whether it was the chicken leavings or some other liquid, Susan felt her feet shoot out from under her as she fell against the china cabinet. Her head smacked against the bulky old thing, and everything went fuzzy as she watched Gus run off into the night. She called his name distantly before passing out and waking up somewhere very different. Susan woke up in the hospital. Her mom was reading a magazine, but as Susan groaned, she called for the nurse and leaned in to have a look at her. The nurse came on the run, and Susan was soon poked and prodded and examined by her mother and several people in scrubs. She was confused and a little scared, and when she asked what had happened, it took her dad coming in from the cafeteria to shed any light on the situation. The complex had called her parents, since they were her emergency contact, to let them know that a neighbor had found her passed out in her doorway. They had called an ambulance, and she had been rushed to the ER with a head wound. She had spent 3 days unconscious, her concussion pretty substantial, and her parents had been worried sick. She asked her dad if he'd been to the apartment, and if he'd seen Gus, but he said he hadn't done much more than put some food in a bowl and lock the place up. "He's probably okay, sweetie. Cats are pretty self-reliant. I'll go back tonight and make sure he has food and water, though." They wanted to keep her at the hospital until they were sure that she was okay, but Susan was adamant that she needed to leave. Gus had gotten out, and she needed to find him. He had been scared by the garbage bag and startled when she grabbed him. He hadn't meant to scratch her. He was probably cold and scared and waiting for her to come home, and she started to cry when they told her it would be a few more days before she was released. Her dad didn't help matters much. He checked on Gus, but said that he must have gotten out. His food bowl was still full, and he hadn't come home when her dad had called him. He had looked around, but he hadn't seen any sign of him. "I'm sure he's just scared and waiting for you to come back. He'll probably meet you at the door when you come home from the hospital," he assured her, his face showing a lot of worry. She came home 3 days later, after the hospital had run every test they could think of, and Susan was greeted by nothing but a plain beige door and a note from her neighbor wishing her a speedy recovery. She opened the front door thinking maybe he would be there, but the house was cold and empty. It felt lonely without Gus there to welcome her, and she decided then that she had to go look for him. Maybe he was close by, playing with the cats he had seen from the balcony. She would get some treats and call him, and hopefully he would come back after some coaxing, and they could be a family again. She was halfway down the hallway when she recognized a pitiful meow from her bedroom. She came through the door looking frantically for Gus. Had he gotten stuck in the bedroom? How had he been eating and drinking this whole week? She expected that he would come pelting out when the door opened, but he was nowhere to be found. She started looking for him under the bed and in the closet, but when the same sad meow came from behind her, she turned and found the source. It was Gus. He was just as fluffy as she remembered him, and it broke her heart to see how thin he looked under all that fur. He looked troubled, his eyes darting around as he put a paw up and pleaded for her to help him. He looked sorry, like he would do anything if she could just help him out of this. And as she approached him, Susan could feel her tears coming down in a torrent. Gus pressed his paw against the mirror. His toes were visible from the other side, and as he pressed and shoved, she could see he was becoming upset. Gus was stuck inside the mirror, his world nothing more than a little room, the one he had loved so much. Susan put a hand up to the mirror, covering his little paw with hers, and only then noticed that she didn't have a reflection. She sat and wondered if she'd have to watch her poor cat Gus waste away, unable to help him, and she laid her forehead against the glass as she cried all the harder. March 3rd. I've always kind of hated my brother. Well, hate's a strong word. I just always hated how easy everything was for him. He's 2 years older than me, but everything just comes so easily to him. In high school, he was in ROTC, taking courses in criminal justice, so he could get a leg up on his law enforcement career. He had a string of friends and girlfriends, and made his high school years amazing. He never seemed to study, always retaining what he needed for tests, and finished his high school a half a year early with a nearly perfect GPA. He didn't need to. He could have just joined the police academy right out of high school, but he chose to join the Army for 4 years, saying it was his duty to his country. He served as an MP and later as a base investigator for base-related crimes. When he got out, he was practically ready to start police work already. Now he's a hotshot detective, while the only thing I got out of high school was an unfavorable comparison to my perfect older brother and too many bullies to count. But it looks like his streak's coming to an end now, while this new string of murders keeps piling up. They're calling him the West End Cannibal, and his crimes are truly horrific. He meets women online, pretty common in this day and age, and then he murders them in their own homes. He cuts them open, sometimes stealing their organs, and they found bites and burns on them as well. The missing organs lead them to believe that he's eating them, but they don't really seem to have any proof. My brother talks ceaselessly about this guy during our weekly meetups to have a beer and talk about life. This is something he insists on, since it gives him an opportunity to talk about himself. My work is so boring that no one in their right mind would want to hear about it. Very little happens to me that would make anyone want to hear about my life. Probably why I'm still single. The crux of it is, my brother told me last week as he sat on his stool at O'Malley's, is that I don't think the bites belong to him. We found dental records from 3 different sets of teeth, and one of them came back with dental records on a recently deceased person. So what, he grave robs too? I asked, not really interested, but wanting to hear him flounder. The guy's still buried, though. We exhumed his body. His wife was right pissed, and we found his teeth intact. We're chasing our tails here. This guy hasn't given us a lot to work with, and his body count is nearly in the double digits now. I pretended to be speculative, but really I was laughing into my beer at him. My perfect brother, so confident and sure of himself, was being thwarted by some nobody. I had sat on this stool for years, just waiting for a story like this. I know it sounds petty, but I like to see him unsure of himself. It makes me realize that he's just as human as I am. March 12th. There were another 2 murders this week. He called me this time, not having time for a beer as the department scrambled to figure this out. I just don't get it, he said, and his voice sounded tired. This guy's a genuine ghost. We have him picking up his first victim on Tinder, but his second victim was some random woman from a bar. Jesus, but he really did a number on her. He slashed off one of her breasts. We found it in the corner. All of her organs were just strewn about the bathroom. We had kind of thought that maybe he was selling them or something, but now he's not even taking them with him. He's just dismembering them and leaving them sitting around. I pretended to listen, cleaning up so I could get home as I prepared to leave my job. But my face likely looked like a kid on Christmas morning. He was really worried about this. He was really worried that he couldn't solve this case. I remember a year ago I watched something similar happen, feeling that this would be the moment of his failure, and wanting to see it. When he caught the guy, a middle-aged cubicle jockey who was murdering prostitutes instead of buying a Jaguar like everyone else who has a midlife crisis, I had watched him crow about it in the press conference and tried not to puke. If pride came before a fall, then his fall was a long time coming. I don't know what I'm gonna do, bro. I've been sleeping like shit. I think Carol is starting to suspect that I'm cheating on her. Are you? I asked, ready to put some more arrows in my quiver. No, of course not. I made a note of his quick dismissal, doubting it and saving it for later. But she sees these long hours and jumps to conclusions. I'm out all night, pounding the pavement, going over evidence, so I must be out having some kind of affair or sleeping with someone at my office. I can't understand it. I've always taken care of her and the kids. I don't know where all this is coming from. Are you on the job now? Yeah, we're driving to a scene now. I'm hoping like hell it's just a copycat. Someone who's a little sloppier than this guy. We tried to keep this out of the news, but when 10 girls get cut up like this, it's almost impossible to keep quiet. I need to catch this guy. My reputation's on the line here. My boss, I could hear him reach up and rub the bridge of his nose, is really coming down on me. We're here. I gotta go. Be safe out there, little brother. There's a lot of crazies out there. I smirked as he hung up, glad to hear he was worried. Maybe this would end his career. Let him see how us normal people lived in the muck of disappointment for a while. Hadn't I lived for most of my life like that? Did my parents throw me a party or buy me a car when I finished college? Had they helped me take my state boards or paid for all kinds of test prep that I didn't need and desperately had wanted? Did they constantly talk about my perfect job and perfect family every time they called to see how I was doing? No, they didn't give a shit about me any more than he did. He just wanted a sounding board for his ideas and someone to nod and tell him, "Sure, big bro, you're so right." Maybe it was his turn to be wrong for a change. March 21st. He must be getting desperate. He actually asked me to come and take a look at a crime scene with him. I was just heading to the bar, ready to be regaled on how he could have possibly let this guy kill 13 women and still have no idea who he was, when he called me. He sounded even more frantic this time. The lack of sleep was starting to catch up with him, I could tell, and he sounded like a cornered animal. I didn't let the glee leak into my voice as I listened to him, but I don't see how he couldn't hear it. Hey, would you mind giving me a second set of eyes? Eyes? For what? We found number 14 today. This guy, I swear, he doesn't seem to sleep. He just finds these women and kills them without hesitation. I don't know what to do. I'm coming up with nothing. We found more weird bites on this one, and I feel like maybe you should come take a look. I don't know, give me some insight. Well, I'm no detective. I don't see how I could be of any help. No, but you work at the mortuary. Maybe you can notice something on the body or notice something on the bites. All my guys are coming up with a blank here, bro. Anything you could tell me would be amazing. I contemplated telling him I was busy, but I thought better of it. Maybe I could help him out. Give him some insight. Wouldn't that just burn him righteously? He picked me up near my apartment, and we rode to the crime scene in silence. My brother kept his eyes forward, but he looked like a smack addict as he snuck glances at me. His hair was unkempt, his ordinarily smooth face covered in coarse stubble, and he shook a little as he drove. I assumed he was past coffee and he'd moved on to caffeine pills as he neared his third week of dealing with these murders. What must Carol think of her husband now that he had completely fallen apart? When we pulled up to the motel, a dingy little place near the interstate, he put a hand on my arm before I got out and looked at me darkly. I want to thank you for agreeing to this. It's pretty brutal in there. Nothing I'm sure you're not used to, though. I'm up against it, bro. I don't know what to do. And when he said it, he started crying. I've never had it this hard. This guy, it's like he's playing with me. He's always one step ahead of me, and my investigators, I don't know what I'm going to do if I can't solve this case. The chief is really coming down on me, and if I can't give him answers, I'm going to lose my place as squad leader. I need some help. Do you think you could help me? I almost couldn't hold my smile. He wanted my help? This was like Christmas and New Year's and losing my virginity rolled all into one. My perfect brother wanted my help. I could just freeze it and eat it. It was so sweet. I agreed, patting his hand and telling him I would do what I could. We moved into the room, and I could see the body hadn't been moved. The room was a mess, blood everywhere, little cards with numbers on them marking organs and cast-off items. The woman's clothes were laying beside the bed, a long hypodermic needle nestled in the bedclothes beside her body. She was splayed out on the bed itself, and her dead eyes looked up at the ceiling. He let me come in, said he'd explain my footprints if it came to it, and gave me gloves just in case. We stood over the bed on opposite sides, my brother looking ready to pop as I assessed the crime scene with my untrained eye. We got a tip-off about an hour ago. Guy called ahead and had the room key waiting at the desk. He sent the girl in to get the key and used a prepaid card so they couldn't track his activity. The card had his transaction on it, and the activity notice was 2 weeks old. He activated it from a burner cell that is currently pinging from a landfill, so we assume he got rid of it. He brought the girl in, shot her full of muscle relaxer, and then he murdered her. No cameras around to see him, no clerk to ID him. No nothing. Left on foot about 2 hours ago, and left the girl in her car here. You sure it was the same guy? I asked. No, but the MO was the same. Organs removed with surgical skill, medical-grade muscle relaxer used to subdue her. No prints found anywhere, and he left her to be found like this. Didn't you say he usually kills them at their homes, though? Yeah, but she was different. Miss Melinda Carr had a husband who was at home at the time of her murder. She brought her lover here so they wouldn't get caught. Boy, did she bet on the wrong guy. I took a look around, under the bed and beside the mattress, before moving into the bathroom. I looked studiously around the motel sink and the long plastic tub. He deposited most of her organs into the sink, writing cheater on the glass in her blood before throwing her heart into the toilet. It was all still as he'd left it. The cops had moved nothing, but it certainly let people know what they were dealing with. After about a half hour of looking, I turned back and shrugged. Sorry, I don't see anything different. Did you, by chance, find out what kind of muscle relaxer the killer was using? No, he must have took it with him. Well, whoever opened her up knows his way around a set of instruments. The cuts aren't sloppy, and the organs were removed with care, but I'm guessing you had figured that out by the 14th body. Yeah, we've been canvassing databases for doctors, surgeons, even veterinarians. So far, nothing. I shrugged again. I don't know. You're the cop, not me. All I can tell you is what I see. It's fine. I'll call you a cab. I really want to stay and have a look at the scene again. Thanks for your help, though. I really appreciate it. He was talking on the phone as I left, calling that cab. As he finished, I heard his phone chirp again, and he answered it. I showed myself out, lingering by the door as a gentle sprinkle of rain began. I could hear him talking to someone through the open door, and it didn't sound work-related. He was telling someone about his hard day, and how the case was killing him, and they must have said something that made him laugh, because his next words seemed a little more upbeat. He told them where he was if they wanted to come visit him at work. I could use a shower like you wouldn't believe. Maybe I'll get a room as far away from this one as possible, and tell my wife I'm working late again. I smirked as the cab rolled up. Seems my hunch about his extramarital affair was correct. Seems my brother wasn't as perfect as everyone thought. April 4th. My brother just called me, but I doubt he'll be here on time. They found another victim, number 20 actually, and my brother was more than a little upset about it. He called me from the scene, and I could hear other cops in the background as he stepped out of the apartment. "Where are you?" he asked, his voice husky. "My apartment. Is something wrong?" He just breathed heavily for a moment as I heard the elevator open and close in the background. "Dee Dee is dead," he said with a little sob as he put his back against the wall in that way he does when news hits him hard. "I'm sorry to hear that, but I don't think I know who that is." She was... Look, I'm having a hard time, okay? Carol was icing me out at home. This case is really getting to me, and Dee Dee was just... She was there for me, okay? I nodded, setting the box I was carrying onto my coffee table as I went back for another one. "So you were having an affair?" It wasn't a question. "Yeah," he said, sounding like I had wrung the omission out of him. "And now this killer you can't catch has caught her. Am I mistaken?" "Yeah, you have no idea how much effort it took to pretend like I didn't know her. I had to stand in that apartment, smelling her perfume, smelling her hot blood, and just... But I think I might have finally caught a lead." "Oh?" I set the box down next to the other one, feigning surprise. "I need you to stay where you are, okay? I want to talk to you about what I may or may not know. I need to talk to you before anyone else talks to you. Can you do that?" I smiled at the phone. "I'll be right here when you get here. Don't worry. I'm always here for you, big brother." He hung up then, and I tossed the phone into a corner somewhere as I arranged the boxes. I wouldn't need it anymore. The noose hung over the table like a surprised voyeur. Beneath it sat boxes of evidence, trinkets I'd taken from my victims, the scalpel I'd used to dissect them, and, of course, the vial of muscle relaxer I'd taken from the scene of the very crime he had asked me to come and have a look at. I know you'll read this, big brother, so I have to thank you for the tag-along on that one. I'd been absolutely certain that you were calling me to let me know you wanted me to come to the station that day. I had just noticed that the vial was missing. A vial with my name on it and everything. I couldn't believe I had been that sloppy. Your forensics team was sure to have found it, and my little plan would be up in smoke. When you asked me to come along, I honestly thought it was a setup. When you asked me to have a look at the scene and tell you what I thought, I was sure it was a setup. When the vial was still there beside the mattress, hidden in a little notch beside the frame, I could have thanked God if I believed in anything so archaic. It was easy to put it in my pocket and continue looking around, your addled brain too fixated on your own crime scene to see me as more than a mouthpiece for what you already knew. You see, the answer should have been clear from the start. You checked the surgeons, the doctors, the veterinarians. That was a slap in the face, I can tell you. But you never thought to check the people who take fucking organs out of dead bodies every day, you moron. It was easy to stay one step ahead of you. I've been sitting on that bar stool and listening to you detail how you catch criminals for years. I had all my ducks in a row from the first murder. I was one step ahead of you before you even knew I existed. And now I will be your greatest failure. You will never catch me, big brother, because when you find this journal, I'll already be dead. This will leave you with a tricky little dilemma. You could inform your colleagues that I was the murderer this whole time. You could admit that you sat right across from me and fed me case-specific information while being unable to identify a murderer in your own family. You could tell them this, but you know that your reputation will suffer for it, and that it will be very difficult for them to trust you after this little revelation. Or you could cover it up, dispose of all the evidence that I've gathered, and pretend that the murderer just stopped killing. You could technically get the win. No more murders means no more shame of being unable to solve them. But you would know, wouldn't you? You would know that I had beaten you, that I had won, and you would have to live with that understanding for the rest of your life. Choice is yours, big brother. I'm about to make mine right now. Well, damn, I said, slamming the book closed as I laid it on the arm of the chair a little harder than I meant to. What's wrong? Grandpa asked, looking up from his Louis Lamar novel. I looked over and could see the snow beginning to fall behind him again. I had hoped the snow would hold off for a little while longer, but it looked like we could be snowbound again. The lull in the snowfall today had been the first time we'd been able to get out on the old truck for about a week, and we had taken the opportunity to get some groceries, eat a meal that we didn't have to cook, and make a trip to the used bookstore in town. Grandpa had a ton of books, but he was always in the mood to get a few more. To his credit, he always bought them, read them, and then shelved them before getting another one, a system I never quite took to. I'd found 3 of the 4 Dragonlance novels, and had been chewing my way through them while we were snowed in. I had hoped to find the 4th one, Dragons of Summer Flame, and, as if sent a gift from Providence, it was sitting midway down the 3 for $1 bin. I should have checked it out before I dropped a whole 33 cents on it, but I'd been too excited to finish the story, and now I'd have to pay the price. Someone tore the last few pages out of my book, I said, my anger growing the longer I thought about it. Now how will I know how it ends? Grandpa laughed. Could be worse. I suppose the pages could be blank. Then you'd know the ruin ate them. I scrunched up my brows. The what? A ruin, Grandpa said, marking his place in his book. It's the bane of all written words, and those who enjoy them. Yeah, I heard you, but what is it? They look like little foxes, and they live in the margins of the books. They eat words, and they steal secrets, something they hoard like a dragon's treasure. I stared at Grandpa for a few minutes to see if he was messing with me, but the longer he stared back, the more I realized that he was serious. Why shouldn't he be? We had faced a creature made from a mass grave just this fall, and Grandpa had spent his time before that teaching me about the different creatures that called the Appalachian wilderness their home. Of all the things I'd heard about in that time, you'd think that nothing would surprise me anymore, but this definitely caught me off guard. Grandma used to say that they were the bane of a well-stocked library. I saw a pair of them once while I was stationed in Alaska. Cute little devils, but they almost ran my friend's sister out of business. Was this the native guy you befriended? I asked, tossing the book on the nightstand, as it was far more interesting to hear this story. Indeed. John White was one of my best friends. It was fortunate that he didn't go to the front lines when the time came, though I doubt he thought himself fortunate at the time. One story at a time, Gramps. Let's talk about these fox things first. Grandpa smiled, tilting his head as he tried to think of a good starting point. I guess it all started when his sister came to visit us at the barracks. Elise was a few years older than John, and they could have been twins if not for the glasses. She came trudging up to the barracks one morning just as we were finishing the top-to-bottom barracks clean that we did every Wednesday, and John separated from us so he could go speak to her. The men were curious. Most of them hadn't seen a woman in about 3 months, what with the snow. Elise didn't have anything for them, though. She talked with John, and they spoke a while in the language the natives spoke on the res. When John pointed at me, his sister looked dubious. They spoke a little longer, and without warning, they parted like players in a huddle. As John came back, he picked up his shovel, and the two of us started pushing sludge off the walk. "Everything okay?" I asked, after he'd shoveled in peace for a few minutes. "Allah is having trouble with a spirit. At least she thinks it's a spirit. It's not like anything she's ever experienced before. I know you have experience with these things. Do you think you might be able to come and help us?" I told him I'd be glad to, and we started making plans for the next time we had leave from the base. As it happens, we both had weekend passes coming up, so we decided that next Friday we'd go into Willowbrook, the city his sister lived in, and see if we couldn't help her. It wasn't uncommon in those days to get leave pretty regular. The war was starting to rattle down a little, and Alaska wasn't exactly under attack every day. Saturday morning, we bundled into the old Jeep in the motor pool, flashed our passes, and headed into Willowbrook. Now, before joining the army, I only thought I was from a podunk town. Willowbrook was a pothole in the road by comparison. It was a reservation town, about 3,000 or 4,000 people in all, with a little main street, a gas station, and a lot of tribal housing scattered willy-nilly about. The army guys went in to drink at the Whale's Belly, the local tavern, or to pick up some comforts at the general store. But that was about the length of where we were tolerated. The reservation guys didn't like us, and most of the army guys didn't like them either. But we kept a certain amount of ignorance of each other and went about our lives. So when an army jeep rolled through town during the daylight hours, you can imagine that it made a little bit of a stir. People watched us drive by with sullen faces full of mistrust, and the sight of a equally native John behind the wheel did very little to change those looks. John took it all in strides, but I could tell it hurt him a little. To have your own people look at you like an outsider was a little different than being an outsider yourself. And when he lifted a hand to an older woman and her daughter, a greeting that was ignored, he let it drop slowly. "They don't like that I joined the army," he told me, as if I hadn't worked that out already. "There's been a lot of tense separation of the reservation people and the military, a separation that I have violated." "I'm sure you had your reasons," I told him, but he only snorted. "My reasons were that Dad wandered off into the woods one night, drunk off whiskey, and never came back. My reasons were the 4 siblings left at home that needed to be fed, and a mother who slid into the same bottle that killed my father. Allah helps. That's why she understands why I enlisted, but the community just sees it as a betrayal." We pulled up outside a squat little building with a sign that declared it to be a public library, and I was surprised to see a little shit-splat town like this with such a service. My own hometown didn't even have a library, wouldn't until almost 1955, and as we walked inside, it seemed to be little more than a long hallway. The shelves were pushed against the walls, giving it a slightly claustrophobic feel, and I couldn't imagine looking for a book in here if it was busy. There was a desk at the end of the hallway, and as we came in, John's sister looked up and greeted us. "You must be the mountain man John's talked about. I'm Elise. Welcome to my library." I shook her hand, thanking her for inviting me. "It's a little cramped, but I'm impressed how well stocked it is." She looked around at the little shelves almost lovingly, clearly pleased with what she had done here. "It took a lot of convincing to get the elders to agree to the space, even more to convince the governor to let me utilize the library resources to get the books I'd need for educational pursuits. They don't seem to understand why a bunch of natives might want to learn more than hunting seals and eating snow. Go figure." She flashed a sardonic grin, and I couldn't help but laugh. After spending time around the serious-minded John, I had expected his sister to be of similar temperament. Elise, however, was downright vivacious. She was a little older than John, about 4 years his senior, and it appeared that she was just as serious about her aspirations as John was. She was a knowledge seeker, someone interested in understanding more than what resides in this world, and she reminded me a little of my grandmother. She made us some tea from a little kettle on the wood-burning stove and told us about her problems. It all started about a week ago. I was shopping in the next town for paperbacks and came across a guy selling a crate of rare books. I looked through them, and sure enough, there were some first editions in there. Most of them were ratty, definitely second-hand, but beggars can't be choosers. For someone with a budget as small as mine, a crate of books for a price so low was too good to pass up. But once I got them back to the library, I realized I'd been had. The books had been vandalized. Pages were blank, paragraphs were missing, some of the books were just completely empty. I got the books that were complete and put them on the shelves, but that's when the others started disappearing. Books I'd had for months, books I'd had since I was a little girl, started being returned incomplete. Paragraphs from the middle of the book, sentences with certain words, and finally, whole books had been scrubbed clean. I don't know what was doing it, but I know it wasn't natural. "How can you tell?" John asked. She took a book off a desk and showed us a series of small paw prints inside it. "They've left these prints in quite a few books. The weird part is, the prints are made with ink, but they're always dry, and they don't smudge on any of the other pages. If it were only a book or two, I could let it slide. Everything must eat, after all, but it has eaten 30 books in the last 6 days. Many others are now incomplete, missing parts of their story, and I don't have the budget to replace so many books. I need them to stop. I need this to stop, because if it doesn't, then the council will close the library for sure." John was perplexed, but I knew exactly what she was dealing with. "They're fox prints," I said, and both of them looked at me in surprise. "As far as I can tell, yes," Elise said, "but how did you know that?" "They're called ruins, or ruins. I'm not sure. Grandma's accent made it a little hard to tell, but she had an infestation of them in her library once. She had picked them up in an old book she'd bought from a traveling man, some collection of old herbs and poultices, and it chewed through some of her books before she caught it. Little terrors, she called them, but she knew just how to trap 'em." "How do we do that?" John asked, intrigued by the idea of something he'd never seen before. "They like to eat written word, but there's one thing above all else they can't resist, and that's secrets. I remember how my grandma had taken out an old leather book from a shelf, lovingly running her fingers over the cover before opening it to a spot in the middle. She inscribed a mark over the childish writing inside, dragging her finger over the page after dipping it in an inkwell, and mumbling to herself. I was small, so I didn't have any clue what she was doing. The symbols she drew lit up a little, and when she closed the book, she laid it on the desk and said it wouldn't be a problem anymore. I asked if Elise had an old journal, something from when she was a kid, and she said she had just the thing. She told us to watch the library for her, and about an hour later she came back with a little notebook under one arm. It's from high school. I'd kept it for an English class, and after the assignment I just kept writing in it. I've been writing in it for the last 4 years. I don't know if there's any particularly good secrets in it, but hopefully it'll help. I paged through looking for something good, and finally came to something I thought would work. It was a passage about a boyfriend that she'd kept from her parents, a boy named Erutious. Her parents wouldn't have approved of him. Their fathers not really getting along. and she had dated him for nearly a year before they had broken up, her parents never having learned about the relationship. It was a secret that had never been learned, and it would be very tantalizing to her ruin. I smudged the page with an ink pen that she had on her desk, making the appropriate sign as I finished the sigil that would seal them inside the book. Leave it out somewhere. They won't be able to resist the pull of secrets. It's in their nature. The ruin will be trapped in the book, forced to eat the words until it starves to death. She thanked us, and we returned to the base, John thanking me for helping his big sister. She's always loved books, and operating a library was a dream come true for her. I'm glad that she can make a living doing something that she loves. His sister came to visit us a few days later, but she'd had a change of heart, it seemed. When she came charging through the gates about midday, I think I'd have rather stood in the way of a charging polar bear. We were at the canteen, moving some supplies off a convoy that brought us our stuff, and John and I were sitting with a few of the other boys as we soaked up the few hours of sun we'd be allotted that day. We saw her when she came up the road, having walked the 3 miles from town, we had no doubt, and John looked worried the closer she got. He told me later that she was wearing the look she wore when you had done something wrong, the look that said that she was about to beat the tar out of you, and it made him feel about 5 years old again. "Get them out," she said, pushing the book at me, and it was the same journal I had used to trap the ruin in, and I was confused as I looked from the book to her. She had her hands on her hips, her face a mask of rage and concern, and the red around her eyes told me that she had been crying. I opened the book and found a pair of sad little foxes on the inside, their images cast across many of the pages and in the margins. It appeared that she had a pair of rune, perhaps a mated pair, and as I flipped through the pages, the two of them seemed to have added to their little family. One of the drawings implied that the other was heavily pregnant, and as I flipped further, I saw her cuddled up with a small group of creatures. Many of the words were gone from the page, the rune having picked them clean for the little family they were cultivating, and the little blue fox that looked out from the page seemed very worried. "You know they'll eat your library bare," I asked her, seeing the rune family was now 8 strong. One rune destroyed years of herbology notes that my grandmother was keeping. I can't imagine what 8 would do. "I don't care," she said. "I don't want to watch them starve to death. They have babies. I can't just sit by and watch them die in the trap we've set." Truth be told, Grandma hadn't been capable of watching it either. She would drive away demons and banish haints, but I'd seen her catch spiders in glasses and take crickets to release outside. She'd taken the book she used to trap the rune in out to the woods and burned it, saying that it would set him free. "If he comes back again, then there's no help for him, but as long as he stays away from my library, I don't see why he can't live in peace." The sudden memory of watching the flames burn the old book away, the ashes rising into the sky as they seemed to turn into a red fox of ash, gave me an idea, and I told Elise what she must do. Take it far away from the library and burn the book. It won't hurt them, and once the sigil is destroyed, they'll be free to leave the book and go about their business. That business might take them back to your library, but if they sense that your intentions are good, they might also move on without a fuss. That seemed to soften her some, and she took the book and thanked me for the help. The Rune family never came back to the library, and I don't know what became of them, but I do know that there was a fire at a nearby military archive that year, about 100 miles from our base. I can't prove anything, but I suppose it's possible that someone found military files and classified documents with holes in the information and decided that it would be easier to burn the whole thing to the ground than explain to the higher-ups. Either way, I'd have hated to have been the man who had to control the tombs when he began to find the words missing on files that could have him locked in military prison for a long damn time. Grandpa leaned back as he finished, looking a little wistful as he thought about his time in Alaska. If I'd had any sense, I'd have stayed in Alaska. It was a hell of a place, a land of wonder and possibility. I nodded, thinking about his story. Good to know that the Appalachians aren't the only place with strange creatures. Grandpa laughed. Though it does have some of the most interesting ones. I saw a few in Europe too, though, when my unit was drug over there for a while. Maybe I'll tell you about it sometime, he said, getting out of his chair and hobbling down the hall. Making an early night of it, Gramps? I asked. But whether he meant to sleep or lay with his memories for a while, he never said. It's something I'd heard my whole life, though it's never been this clear. If I make this shot, the world lives. As a kid, it would wrestle across my brain like a flock of birds. Sometimes if I was thinking hard about something, and sometimes when I was just being quiet and trying to focus. It was never distracting, never something that tore me away from my day-to-day life, and in fact, it made me feel safe. It wasn't even in my voice, not any voice I was familiar with. They say that when you talk to yourself, and your internal voice talks back to you, it's still your voice. This voice wasn't like anything I'd ever heard. My whole life, it sounded like the same childish trill. As I got older and started going to church, I started to think it might be something different. I noticed that the voice always came before something good, giving me the confidence to try things I wouldn't normally do. I'd hear the voice just before a test, or right before I stepped up to bat, and I'd know that everything was about to turn out great. The more it happened, the more I became convinced that I was special. The longer it went on, the more I thought I was hearing the voice of God. I told my priest about it, my family being very Catholic, and he said it sounded like I had a close relationship with God. Even at 8 years old, I could tell that he didn't believe me, but I didn't care. I knew what I was hearing, and I knew it was important. The more it pushed me towards success, the more I started saying it to myself like a mantra. I'd say, if I make this shot, the world will live, just before I went on stage for a debate. I'd say, if I make this shot, the world will live, just before I took a test. I'd say, if I make this shot, the world will live, just before I hit a ball, or threw a basketball, or did anything I wanted to succeed at, and if I heard the voice say it back, then I'd know that I was about to do great things. It's what pushed me into the priesthood, and pushed me to my ultimate act of blasphemy. That's not the right word, but it's the best I can think of. It had been 30 years since I'd first heard that voice, and I was now a young priest with a church of my own. I had built a reputation with the other priests for writing sermons that kept parishioners in their seats and having a lot of luck regarding matters with the diocese. I'd gotten through the ranks faster than most, doing very well on my tests of catechism and church doctrine. At this rate, I was on my way to becoming one of the youngest bishops in my area. I had never told any of them about the voices, thinking it was similar to the way people in the Bible had heard the voice of God once upon a time. I knew it wasn't okay for me to think of myself as a prophet, but whatever the reason, I was still certain that it was the voice of God. I should have been pleased, but I found myself thinking more and more about the nature of the phrase. I'd hear it before sermons sometimes, and know that today's reflection on the Lord's words would be particularly captivating. I still said it to myself before doing anything, and I realized that it'd become kind of a lucky charm to me. Things would go well, and I would attribute it to the mantra. But why did I make this leap? Because it had always been? I needed to be sure. So I started doing research. Luckily, or unluckily, the The Catholic Church has a lot of resources for those looking to research the nature of religion. There was a lot of information on prophets, others who had communicated with God and his messengers, but my own situation was unique. I heard the same phrase again and again, and if it was the voice of God, then it was the first for such repetition. God told his prophets and chosen mouthpieces what he wanted them to do. Go to Nineveh, free the Hebrews, sacrifice your son. Whatever he was asking people to do, he was always very specific. If I make this shot, the world will live was not particularly specific, though. I don't want any of you reading this to think that I went in only from a position of faith. I started by having a checkup with Dr. Redman, my family physician. He ran a series of tests to determine if I had any underlying conditions, perhaps a tumor or some undiagnosed schizophrenia. It would have been easier if it was just something I could chalk up to external stimuli, but Dr. Redman told me I was healthy as a horse when the results came back. EKG, EEG, X-ray, physical, CT scan, heck, you even passed the cardiac battery with flying colors. I hope the Vatican has deep pockets, because I'd imagine you just broke your healthcare budget for the year. I thanked him, figuring the church could foot the bill for my upcoming research. With the tests showing that I was in the right state of mind with a sound body, I started studying ways to instigate a more receptive state. There were several accounts of priests fasting and praying so they could speak with God, and while the idea of starving myself didn't appeal to me, it seemed to be the best way to find out more about the voice. It had never changed through the years, still sounding youngish with the first rumblings of depth, and I wanted to know if the phrase had some deeper meaning. The Lord works in mysterious ways, but if he had some job for me, I needed to disseminate what it was. I told my aides what I meant to do, giving them special instructions not to bother me, but to check on me periodically. If they found me passed out or unconscious, they had specific instructions to offer aid. If I was hurting myself, worse than depriving myself of sleep and food, I meant, they were to call the hospital and have me admitted. As long as I was still praying or meditating or not doing myself any harm, they would leave me to it. I planned to conduct my little experiment from Sunday night to Saturday night of the following week, and on the following Sunday, I would come to Mass with something to talk about for my weekly sermon. I had no idea how prophetic that statement would be. So, after Mass on Sunday night, I locked myself in my study, ate my last meal for the week, and began to read. I started at the beginning, reading of creation and of the garden, and as the hours stretched on, I began to read aloud to keep myself awake. The first night was easily the hardest. My body cried out for sleep as my stomach grumbled for lack of food. By the time Brother Joseph had come to check on me the next morning, I was past the worst of it and still reciting the book of Numbers. He left me water, asking me how I felt before leaving me to it. This was the height of my excitement for the project. I'd only been awake for about a day, and my zeal was still running high. I had heard the words 3 or 4 times throughout the night, and they had been clearer than they had ever been before. Sometimes the words were muffled, sounding like a kid's tin can phone, but that night the words were crisp and clear. I read for the rest of the day, hearing them 2 more times, and as night settled in, I felt tired, but still with hope and God's love. By day 3, some of my enthusiasm was starting to slip. I'd heard the words a few more times, twice perhaps, but I was starting to feel the effects of sleep deprivation. My stomach was also in a knot, and my head was swimming as my blood sugar fluctuated wildly. I had read stories about men fasting for weeks at a time, and I couldn't imagine another day of this. The only thing that kept me going was the knowledge that, the few times I'd heard it, the voice had been clear as a bell. Thursday night found me doing laps in my study when I finally got my answer. I had finished the Bible Wednesday night, and had moved on to the Contemplations of Dogma by Cardinal Mansfield. I had thought about praying, but it was tempting to sleep if I wasn't walking. I had been awake for 4 days now, and my desire to rest was almost as invasive as my desire to eat. I was dizzy as I read, the words running together, and as a stomach cramp hit me, I saw the book tumble from my hands as I doubled over. I thought I might throw up the water I had drunk a few hours ago, but instead I continued forward and fell to the floor. I landed next to the book, my world going black as I fell over. and I wasn't sure if I was going to wake up. If I make this shot, the world lives. I could hear the voice as if someone were whispering it into my ear. I opened my eyes and was suddenly aware of floating. I was hovering over the shoulder of a young giant, his face that of a high school or college student. He was writing an essay, his pencil scratching on the page as he toiled away at his work. He would stop and erase something before starting again, and as I moved closer, I could see that he had a small stack of finished papers beside him on the desk. How long he'd been writing on this essay was anyone's guess, but with an angry growl, I watched him crumble up the page before turning in his chair to face me. If I make this shot, the world lives. With a smooth and practiced arc, I watched him toss the paper into a nearby garbage pail before returning to his work, his pencil scratching away as he wrote. I was speechless. What was I seeing here? Was this God? It couldn't be. Could it? As he furrowed his brow, I saw that this essay wasn't the only thing on his desk. There was a manuscript, too, the title page proclaiming it to be Golden Fields. I began to understand why I had heard him say the mantra so many times. I assumed it was part of his process, and the throwing away of ideas was as much a part of it as writing itself. If I were to read that manuscript, I wondered, would I find a priest in it? Perhaps one who hears voices? Was this man my creator? My God? The architect of everything that I knew and loved? I came to in the emergency room, Brother Marcus having found me seizing on the floor and called an ambulance. Now I lie here, contemplating what I saw. Was it real? Did I actually see these things? Did I actually see this being, or was it something my mind created? As I sit here, I can still hear the words from time to time, but I don't say them anymore. The church has given me a short leave of absence, but I don't know if I can ever go back to my old life. How can I preach of God and glory while I know in my heart that we exist because of a single being and his ability to throw a paper ball into a hoop? It makes me realize how insubstantial we are, how little we matter. But that's not the worst thing that has occurred to me while I lay here. As I sit and listen to the listless beeps of the machine, I find my mind circling back to the same question again and again. If he should miss his next shot, what would happen? Would we ever know? If he missed his next shot, would we continue to live, or simply snuff out into non-existence? I won't go back to work tomorrow. I don't care what Jack says and how much he threatens to tell my probation officer. I will not hear the way my coworkers laugh at me. They tell me it's nothing, but they didn't see what I saw. They haven't seen the spot like I did today. Yeah, I did a little time. I'm not proud of it, but I'm not going to bullshit anybody and tell them a lie. I got a little too drunk one night and assaulted someone in a bar. It was my first offense, and I did my 2 years without much hassle. Hell, they even let me do the last year at work release, so I could keep paying my parents' mortgage for them. I have experience in construction, so it was a good fit. They set me up with a crew, doing drywall and laying flooring, and I worked for a good bunch of guys. It was a sweet gig, and it was a gig I was told I could keep after I got released. On the day I was released, I told them I'd see them in a few days and rejoin the real world. That, however, was the night my dad suffered a stroke. It was a bad one. Mom woke me up screaming, and we took him to the hospital in the back of an ambulance. Suddenly there were doctors to talk to, changes to make to the house I'd grown up in, and a man who'd once taken care of me to take care of. He'd lost function in nearly half his body, and with Mom feeling very overwhelmed, it became my job to take care of Dad. It wasn't until my probation officer informed me that I was in danger of violating my probation that I realized it had been almost a month since I'd been released. I understand that you've got some things going on, but you have to maintain employment as part of your probation. Your job with a construction firm says that they'll let you come back if you're still interested, but you have to have some income coming in by next week or risk violating your probation and going back to prison. I went to the foreman the next day to see if I could get my old job back, but it appeared I was in for a surprise. "Yeah, sorry. We filled your spot on that crew. We didn't know if you were coming back, and we needed a full crew for the job." I gritted my teeth and resisted the urge to rage at him. "Then why did you tell the probation officer I could come back?" "'Cause I have a new crew for you, if you're still interested in it." I told him I was, and he gave me a number to call. "That's Jack. He's been begging for another able body. Give him a call and see if you guys can meet up today." I thanked him, inwardly fuming that he'd already filled my position, and called the number. Jack answered on the third ring and told me that his crew left at 5 a.m. If I wanted a spot on it, I'd better be on the yard at 5 a.m., ready to work. I told him I would, and he hung up on me mid-sentence. I already didn't have a good feeling about this guy. He was terse, and didn't sound like the kind of guy you wanted to have a beer with after work. Regardless, I needed the work, so I set my alarm the night before and dragged up before dawn to meet this asshole at the yard at 5 a.m. And oh boy, had I been right in my hunch about this guy. Jack was one of those average-sized dudes who thinks he's a giant, the kind of guy who gets his ass beat in prison. He wore jeans and a sleeveless t-shirt, with a gold chain that hung down into his thick chest hair. His hair was held in place with enough grease to change the oil in my car, and I saw him single me out the second I showed up. He had a small crew, maybe 10 guys, but the way he zoned in on me let me know that he'd been looking for me. Well, you actually showed up. Rick may speak highly of you, but I'm not just going to drop somebody down so some ex-con can have a job. You'll be cleaning the job site until I'm convinced that you're not going to show up high or just dip out in the middle of the day. If that's not okay with you, then you're going to go tell your probation officer to send you back where you came from." He turned and walked away, the crew piling into his truck as I stood there in stunned silence. I had to remind myself that I needed this job as I piled into the back of the truck with them. I had to remind myself a lot over the next few hours that Mom and Dad needed me home and not back in prison. We pulled up outside this dumpy-looking house in the suburbs just as the sun started to come up over the horizon. It was an old 2-story with a peeling exterior, and a yard that looked like it had last been mowed during the Bush administration. They had made a pathway up to the walk so that they could bring in their tools, and the grass looked stomped flat by the constant traffic. They had set up a generator near the porch, and a big metal dumpster created an island in the grass where they had just rolled it off and dropped it. All in all, it was a sloppy-looking sight, but I was in no position to throw stones. Jack collected us up on the porch so he could give out assignments. The old house was being renovated so the company could flip it, and he set several of us to ripping up carpet. After assignments were given, Jack and 3 others went upstairs to assess the damage, and I didn't see them come back until after lunch. I was set to pulling carpet in the downstairs living room. It was a dingy little room with a pair of small windows that reminded me of eyes. The carpet was disgusting, covered in hair and crumbs, and it was tacky like old soda had been spilled on it. I was sliding on my gloves when someone threw a crowbar on the floor and walked off. "Hey, aren't you going to help me?" I asked, but the guy who tossed the crowbar just shook his head. "We each get a room. This one's yours, so get to it." Then they left me to pull carpet in this big dirty room by myself. The living room wasn't huge, but it was still a lot to ask of one person. I pressed the crowbar in and pulled the carpet away from the wall, not bothering to be gentle. The drywall was going to be pulled out next, and I suddenly wondered why they were pulling the carpet out first. I shrugged. I wasn't the boss here, so I guess I'd just have to do as I was told. That was the first time I noticed the spot. It was in the corner of the living room, a big water stain that seemed to take up 2 walls. It was about the size of a basketball, and the water spot looked like it would be wet if you touched it. It kind of freaked me out, for some reason, though I couldn't tell you why at the time. As I worked, I could almost swear it was moving, just a little, and I got that feeling like eyes on the back of my neck. You know the feeling, the one that makes your hair prickle up, the one that makes you think you might be being watched. I tried not to let it bug me, but it was like I could feel that spot as I worked. The carpet didn't take too long. An hour later, I had rolled it up and was ready to haul it out. I looked around for help, but the others were still hard at it, or at least pretending to be. I could see 3 of them sitting around smoking or chatting for every one guy working. When I asked them to help me get the carpet out to the dumpster, they just scoffed and waved me off. I couldn't move it by myself, so I just left it in the living room and went to look for more carpet to pull. It seemed that my fellow workers weren't as diligent as I was, because there was still carpet in 3 rooms that seemed to need removing. I sighed. This was clearly going to be my life for a while, and I set to work pulling the carpet to get ready to haul it all out. As I worked in a bedroom, the wall painted off blue with stormy-looking clouds on it, I got the feeling that someone was watching me. I turned to the door, thinking maybe one of my coworkers had come to see who was making so much noise back here, but there was no one. I looked to the window, but it was so caked with dust that no one could have seen anything through it. I glanced over to the closet, thinking maybe someone was lurking in there, and that was when I saw the source of my discomfort. A basketball-shaped spot on the wall over the closet door. I tried to convince myself it was nothing. It was just a water spot. The house was probably full of them, and I just happened to have found one that looked exactly like the other one I had seen. I kept working, pulling up tack strips in places, but it still felt funny, like something was watching me. As the carpet rolled up, I began to push it towards the door, sending up puffs of smoke as it thumped over. As I pushed, I couldn't help but glance at that spot. It was still there, hanging over the closet door, seeming to watch me as I worked. I turned to look at it squarely and gasped as I noticed a large white hole in the middle of the spot, like an eye floating in a puddle. I ran out of the room then, bumping into another worker as I beat a hasty retreat. "There you are," he said tersely. "We've been looking for you. Come help us move this carpet." I was more than happy to oblige, anything to get out of that room, and we spent the rest of the morning hefting carpet. We pulled it to the dumpster, tossing it in haphazardly, and then assessed the work for tomorrow. As we broke for lunch, I had almost forgotten about the spot. People being around me made me feel a little crazy about being afraid of it, but as we worked, I could swear I saw it again and again. The walls were covered in stains. The pipes were likely bad, but this one was definitely the same spot. It had the same wobbly edges and deep black center as the one I'd seen the first time. The white circle was gone, though, but I still found myself looking for it when I was in a room. The guys on the crew must have noticed because they started making jokes about how prison had made me jumpy. "He's got to check all the corners when he comes in to make sure no booty bandits are lurking," a big, slovenly one in overalls would say, and they'd all laugh like it was the funniest thing they'd ever heard. If I didn't need this job so bad, I'd have made something of it. We moved upstairs eventually, finding 2 bedrooms and a bathroom that needed carpet or flooring removed. By 5 o'clock, we had all the carpet out of the house and in the dumpster out front. Jack came back in a truck, handing out paychecks and thanking the guys for their hard work. When he came to me, he handed me the check grudgingly, scowling the whole time and holding it when I tried to take it from him. "Tomorrow I expect some real work out of you, not just half-assing it like you did today." I took the check and walked off. I'd find my own way back. The next day was a little better. Drac said that the drywall would come next, and then he and his cronies disappeared out to the truck while the rest of us worked. We all started tearing out drywall, dust and nails flying, and I meant to swing my hammer into that spot extra hard when I saw it. To my disappointment, though, the spot never showed up. I'd seen it everywhere yesterday, seen it in every room at least once, but today it was absent. We spent the day tearing out drywall and cleaning up after ourselves. When 5 o'clock came, we packed up and went out to get paid. Today had been better. Nothing builds camaraderie like a little hard work, and I found myself joining in on the jokes and conversation that happened in the group. We were covered in drywall dust as we walked out that afternoon, laughing about how Tony had been scared by a rat when it burst out of the drywall in the laundry room. Jack looked at them coldly, affronted that they had accepted me so easily. He handed me my check in silence, and I piled into the back of the truck with the others this time. The next day was the last day I'd get to work with them. We spent that day hanging drywall downstairs. Between the 10 of us, we worked diligently and quickly. The drywall went up a sheet at a time, something I was pretty good at, and I was glad to see it covered the hollow studs and the newly blown-out insulation. We marked a few spots where the beams were rotten, but the pipes actually looked pretty good, as did the electrical. I began to wonder what had made the spots I kept seeing. They looked so wet, but I pushed it out of my mind as I worked beside my newfound companions. By 5 o'clock, we'd done most of the downstairs, and we'd have the rest finished by tomorrow so we could move upstairs. When I walked out onto the porch, though, I realized I'd forgotten something. I had rubbed at my wrist, looking for the reassuring feel of metal that had gotten me through 2 years in the can, but I found only bare skin. My heart skipped a beat. My dad's watch was gone. When I remembered that I had laid it on the counter, not wanting it damaged while I was working, I must have forgotten all about it in the bustle. I grabbed my check and turned to go back in the house, Jack scowling at me as I walked off. "We're leaving," he called to my back, but I waved him off. "If you're gone when I get back, I'll just find my own way." I wasn't about to leave my watch here overnight. I went to the kitchen and checked the counter, but there was nothing there. It was powdery with dust from today's work, and I thought I could see an indent where the watch had been. I checked underneath the counters and around the floor, but I couldn't find my watch. I began to look around, hoping it hadn't found its way into someone else's pocket. I walked through the rooms, looking into each of them, to see if I'd maybe left it there, and when I looked into the living room, I was rewarded for my effort. Sitting in the dead center of the debris-riddled floor was my missing watch. I took a step, but something brought me up short. A little tickle on the back of my head told me that it was a little too convenient. It was like a trap baited with something for an unlucky animal to blunder into. I shook it off. I wanted my watch, damn it, and I wasn't going to just abandon it because I had a hinky feeling. I bent down to get it, wrapping my fingers around the cold metal, when I saw something out of the corner of my eye. It was pulsating, sludgy, something that I had seen soaking into the new drywall. I looked up exasperated, figuring that someone had put a nail through a pipe at some point today. But what I saw drew me up short. I was left half bent, filled with fear, as I saw the oozy black spot seething on the drywall. It was bigger than a basketball now, its inky depth seeming to beat like a heart. As I watched, I could see 2 white circles materializing out of the soup. They rolled around like lost eggs and finally came to rest in the middle of the sludge. I wanted to run. I didn't want to see whatever was in that thing, but I was trapped like a deer in headlights. I felt my breath hitching in my chest and could only wait for my legs to regain their strength. The white orbs rolled around in the soup and became eyes. They blinked at me, their centers trained on me as I bent there. All at once, a Cheshire cat smile floated under them as it beamed at me. I was stuck looking into that inky hole, the edges dribbling down the fresh drywall as it oozed and ran. Suddenly I was sure that part of that darkness was ahead with the eyes that were looking out at me from whatever inky void it inhabited, maybe with hands that wanted to pull me into that dark hole it inhabited. As if it had read my mind, I saw dark hands grip the edges of the spot, trying to pull itself out and enter my world. It never lost eye contact as it pulled itself out, and I could see the vague outline of its head as it came free of the spot with that placental pop. It was all I needed to see. Suddenly my legs were moving in overtime, my heart was racing like a steam engine, and I was out the door and slamming it behind me before I could quite remember how I had gotten onto the porch. Even through the blood pounding in my ears and the rubber of my sneakers pounding on the wooden floor, something else dominated my hearing, and there was one sound that I would never forget. I may not be able to remember how I came to be on the porch, heaving and gasping for air, but I do remember the sound I heard just before I threw the door open and I was free. It was a plop and a splatter, similar to a bucket of paint being emptied on the ground. I ran home, calling Jack as I took off up the sidewalk. He picked up on the second ring. "I'm not coming back for you. I told you that I was..." "Jack, you got to get somebody back to the site. Someone's there." "Who?" Jack asked, and I could hear his skepticism. "If this is some kind of goof, I don't get it." I told him how I'd gone back for my watch and I'd seen someone skulking about the site. I didn't tell him about the oozing hole in the wall. He'd see that. However, I did tell him that I had thought the guy might be on drugs, so he should probably be careful. He was banging his fists on the drywall, so I booked it, I finished, trying to keep it believable. The crew was just starting to warm up to me, and I didn't want them to think I was a nut job. "Jesus Christ, I thought you ex-cons were tough. I'll go have a look. You just stay home. I'll let you know what I find." That was hours ago. Since I got home, I've been in my room, waiting on Jack to call, and I decided to write this while I waited. When I opened my laptop, though, my desire to get this down became all the more prevalent. As I slid it open, I caught a glimpse behind me, and realize that I'll be fortunate if I have time to finish this tale. I could see a basketball-sized hole reflected in the screen of my laptop. I got up and locked the door and moved my writing to the living room. I don't know if the locked door will stop whatever may come from that dribbling hole, but I know that it may give me enough time to finish this before it breaks the surface. Keep your eyes peeled for water spots. You never know what might come slipping out.
"What brings you to the ER today?" I asked boredly. "I need a checkup. I recently got over an illness, and I really just need someone to have a look at me." The guy on the bed looked healthier than anyone I'd seen today. He lacked the phlegmy sound that most of the others had shown, the cough so full of rails, and the fever that spiked up on the low end of 101. That was pretty weird. After checking in 14 others with similar symptoms in just the hour since I'd gotten back from lunch, I could have easily rattled off their symptoms myself. But this guy had none of the usual hallmarks. Kashmir was in the grip of a flu epidemic, and they'd enticed me in with the promise of overtime if I'd come in and help with ER intake. I had splurged a little more than I strictly meant to on that year's Steam Christmas sale, and with my pockets a little lighter in the new year, I had no choice but to put in some OT if I wanted to pay my rent this month. "Well, I've got to have something to put down on the page if you want the doc to take you seriously. What brings you into the ER today?" He looked unsure, like someone who doesn't know where to begin. I was sick, but then something happened last night. Something I'm really not sure how to describe. I raised an eyebrow at him, intrigued as I took a seat. "Start from the beginning, then. I'll figure it out as we go." Kenny was sick. Sicker than he'd been in a long time. His throat hurt, his head spun from fever, and the coughing made him feel like his chest might cave in. It felt like the flu, and Kenny was afraid that he might have finally caught the COVID that he'd tried so hard to avoid since the start of the pandemic. Unlike his friends, Kenny had gotten vaccinated, gotten his boosters, and taken any new supplement he could get to steel his immune system against whatever might come. He'd watched his dad suffer through it in the ICU for almost 2 months, his life hanging in the balance every second of the day. When he'd finally come out on the other side, he'd still been weak as a kitten for months after. He was only now getting back to something like normalcy, and his sickness had made Kenny downright scared of the virus. For the last 2 years, he'd had so much vitamin C and immune booster rolling around in him that he hadn't even picked up the common cold, and when he'd started coughing, he knew that something had finally caught up with him. When his COVID test came back negative, he'd breathed a thick sigh of relief. After what he'd been through, he almost wished it had been positive. At least then, Kenny would have had something to attribute all the weirdness to. It started with drainage. Kenny had never been the kind of person to carry a handkerchief, but now he seemed to go through 3 a day. The poor rags would be sodden by the end of it, thick with mucus from his constantly runny nose. The running nose and the constant throat drip had seemed to come before the other symptoms, and Kenny found that he was always honking his nose or coughing up phlegm. The flow was endless, and his chest soon hurt from all the coughing and hacking. He had called work to let them know what was going on, and his foreman was more than happy to let him stay home. "I've been trying to get you to use that vacation time for months. Sounds like a perfect opportunity for you to take a 2-week vacation." "Pfft, some vacation," Kenny spat, coughing up a big glob of mucus into the trash can. "Take your days and enjoy getting paid for being sick," he'd shot back, telling him he'd see him in 12 days before hanging up. Kenny grumbled as he hung up, not thinking he needed 2 weeks, but by the next day, he was thankful for the time. He'd woken up to find his skin on fire. Kenny was burning up, his thermometer saying that he had a fever of 101.2. His head pounded, his throat felt scratchy, and his nose and throat gushed snot. He blew it out, hacked it up, and constantly felt it trickling down his throat. He spent most of that second day in bed, reeling with the fever, and feeling like he didn't have the strength to do much but turn his head and watch a little TV. His one foray into the kitchen had been to grab a few bottles of water, a bag of chips, and a few granola bars. One of the water bottles was now a soupy, half-full mix of hacked-up phlegm and spit, and Kenny had been watching Friends through owlish eyes as he slipped in and out of consciousness. He was absolutely miserable and knew he needed cold medicine if he wanted to get past this. He was trying to get up, his arms shaking as he tried to rise, and the next thing he knew, he was lying in a puddle of drool and snot as the sun shone and his stomach gurgled. That was how the vomiting had started. The granola bars and chips were joined in the bowl by an alarming amount of green goo. His sinuses had been constantly draining since this all started, and every upheaval brought more of it out of his stomach. He had moved to the bathroom then, the vomiting and nausea only adding to his weakness, and Kenny was soon lying on the floor with a towel under his head. That was the first time he thought he might die, as he lay shuddering and coughing next to the toilet. His body ached, and not only from the fever. He was sore from all the throwing up and coughing, and when he tried to get his legs under him so he could go get some water, they shook too much to hold him. He had to drag himself to the tub and drink some from the spout before passing out again on the cold tiles. He woke up covered in something and worried that he had thrown up on himself in his sleep. He was relieved, realizing that he could have choked to death on his own sick, but as his hands slid over his arms, he realized that it wasn't puke. As his hands came away slimy, he lifted one of them to his face to see a thin coating and realized it was the same stuff that was all over the floor. It was snot. His own mucus had dribbled from his nose and puddled on the ground around him. He swiped the same hand over his face and came away with a translucent trail of spidery fluid. Kenny was transfixed by it, watching the light play off the muck as the vanity lights hit it. But as he watched, he saw little else to do but drag himself into the bathtub. It took all his limited energy to pull himself over the lip, and he more or less fell into the basin. Kenny lay on his back, gasping for air, as he stared at the popcorn ceiling and felt the mucus slide out of his nose. It wet his shoulder, soaking his back as it pooled, and Kenny could do little more but lay there, panting like a dog. He spent the day sipping water from the tap, his body still racked with coughing and fever. The plastic wasn't as cold as the tile, soaking up some of the heat that Kenny managed to turn on before his body had gone into rebellion. He could still feel the snot as it dribbled around him, his shoulders feeling sticky. He hacked up more of it, letting it fall to the side as it mingled with the rest. As the day waned, Kenny felt his stomach rumble and curled into a ball as he felt his gorge rising again. Tears began sliding out of his eyes, his pathetic state becoming too much to handle. As he swiped at his eyes, the tears came away in long ropes. His tears were viscous, sticking to his hand, and when he shook them, they also proved to be mucus. Kenny snapped his eyes shut, the tears still flowing as his nose ran like a faucet. He shuddered himself to sleep at some point, praying to anyone who might be listening to just make it all go away. When he opened his eyes next, Kenny thought he might have accidentally turned the water on. He was semi-submerged in a warm, thick liquid, and upon realizing this, Kenny surfaced as he sucked in breath. His face was slimy, his eyes crusted shut as the thick sludge coursed from them. No, not just his eyes, though. His ears, his nose, even the corners of his mouth seemed to run continuously. Now that he was sitting up, the liquid was nearly up to his waist, and as he scrubbed his eyes open, he could see that his pores also flowed with the stuff. He was like a toad, his skin slick and oozing, and when his stomach heaved, he doubted anything he'd eaten would come up. As the wave of thick green slime rocketed up his throat, he realized he'd been right. His upheaval filled the tub more, the thick snot coating his throat as it hit the plastic tub like sleet. He was powerless to stop it, and when he fell, he turned his head so he wouldn't break his nose. He continued to vomit, but it was more like he was hacking into a napkin. His throat should have been raw after all this, but it only felt sticky amidst so much mucus. Kenny wheezed, his coughs thick and watery, and he felt like he was drowning. He'd read about dry drowning once, when you breathe in water and it saturates your lungs as it drowns you slowly, and that was how he felt. His breath was soupy, but he still managed to pull in the oxygen he needed as the goop poured out of him. The mucus flowed from every pore, and as it did, he felt his eyes getting heavy. He didn't want to sleep. He knew that if he couldn't keep his head up, he'd drown in this stuff. but he was powerless to stop himself. He was out of energy, and as Kenny slipped off, he wasn't sure that he'd ever wake up again. He came to sometime in the middle of the night, the tub empty, and his lungs and chest clearer than they'd been in days. The mucus pool was gone, but whether it had gone down the drain or simply left on its own, Kenny would never know. He had a vague sort of memory, almost a dream, of floating weightlessly in a pool of green. It churned around him like a great ocean, moving him as he lay there. He was weightless, rising and falling at its leisure, and as he drifted within it, he felt like a caterpillar must while hanging in its cocoon. Wherever it had gone, it had also taken his fever and weakness with it. As Kenny sat up, he felt like a new man. His stomach growled, and he got up to make food, steadying himself as he nearly slipped on the remains of his sickness. If it hadn't been for that thin coating of slime at the bottom of the tub, Kenny might have wondered if he'd ever been sick at all. That shiny layer of mucus, however, reminded him of the miserable night he'd spent as it poured from every orifice. He made a mental note to go to the hospital the next day, and after a shower and a good meal, he slept sounder than he had in days. "And that was yesterday when you woke up in the tub?" I asked, not quite believing what I was hearing. The man nodded. "It was the strangest thing. I felt better than I had in months, and I haven't even had any of my usual allergy symptoms for this time of year. I normally keep a runny nose after October, but I haven't had to sniffle or blow it at all. It's like I pushed every ounce of snot out of my body, and now I'm just free of it." I finished filling out his form, telling him the doctor would be in to see him soon. Looking over it now, I can't help but shake my head. I thought maybe it was just the hospital that was odd, but the more stories like this I collect, the more I think it might be the whole town. Kashmir is an epicenter of strangeness, and the longer I work here, the more I believe it's starting to get worse.